Chapter 704. The early autumn rain grew heavier and heavier. When it landed on the ground, it created splashes. When it landed on the body, it drenched the lapels of clothing. When it landed on the heart, it was incomparably cold. The square in front of the royal palace was completely enveloped in a misty rain. All one could see was a wet world. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the small wooden platform in the autumn rain, looking at the two people on the platform. There was a deathly silence all around. No one knew what kind of emotion had infected and controlled them. No one spoke, no one moved. They just stared at each other, their gazes piercing through the heavy rain and focusing on the platform. Hundreds and thousands of imperial soldiers, internal court aces, and ascetic monks of the Qing temple stood nervously and solemnly in the rain like frozen wooden figures. In just a moment, a number of people had already died at Sir Fan Jr.'s hands. Most importantly, the rain was falling bitterly. They did not know what color of emotion flashed through the eyes of the emperor on the palace walls. Yin Bingyun had already recovered from his shock when he first saw Fan Xian's figure. He lowered his head and began to prepare for what might happen next. In a low voice, he gave orders to the most loyal subordinates at his side. These voices were covered by the rain. No one heard them. However, a few Overwatch Council secret agents wearing normal clothing had already begun to push their way through the crowd toward the execution field. Above and below the palace walls, the officials and commoners were all stunned by the scene of Fan Xian's horse's hooves trampling through the blood, drawing his sword in rage in the rain, and taking off his clothes to cover the old man's body. The first person to react was He Zhongwei, who had the highest position in the royal palace and was responsible for supervising the execution. When Fan Xian rode into the sea of people, he had already reacted. Using the fastest speed and the most inconspicuous movement, he quietly left the area of the small wooden stage and hid his figure behind the officials and guards. Separated by many aces, his gaze passed through the wet shoulders and straw hats. He looked at Fan Xian alone and wretchedly holding Chun Pingping's thin and weak body on the small wooden stage. A complicated emotion flashed through He Zhongwei's eyes. He just didn't want to die, but he had to kill both the old man and the young man on the wooden stage. There were still many people who did not want to die. On the wooden stage, Fan Xian's entire body emanated a frightening coldness. Even the cold autumn rain between heaven and earth could not suppress it. Everyone unconsciously left the wooden stage. Eunuch Yao had long retreated into the group. He didn't want to become the next straw dog the Duke used to sacrifice to Qin Pingping. Several corpses were scattered around the wooden platform. The color of the blood was quickly diluted by the autumn rain. The trembling executioner of the Ministry of Justice, holding a sharp knife, had become the closest person to the bottom of the wooden platform. He looked at Sir Fan Jr. on the stage and found that Sir Fan Jr. had his head lowered deeply and was holding Director Qin tightly in his arms. It was as if he could not hear any other sounds in the world. His heart was filled with shock as he quietly retreated. After only taking 2 steps, the executioner's throat snapped with a crack. His head fell heavily into the rain. The headless body also fell off the stage with a heavy thud. Everyone was shocked and focused on the stage. Only those with high cultivation could notice that in that instant, Fan Xian's hand had moved slightly. A black dagger flew out and landed in the rain. Fan Xian sat cross-legged on the wooden stage. He sat under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, but it was as if he couldn't feel any of their gazes. He only held Chun Pingping's body and buried his head very low, allowing the rain to fall on his head and body. His back view was slightly slanted and appeared very desolate. The old man's body in his arms was very light. Holding him in his arms was like holding a ball of wind that could disperse at any moment. Under his slightly messy hair, Fan Xian's pale face twitched slightly. Unconsciously, he stretched out his hand and grasped Chun Pingping's cold and old hand. He held it tightly, unwilling to let go again. The old man had experienced a great deal of suffering in this life. He had been disabled for half his life, and the qi and blood in his body had long been exhausted. When he was being cut by 1,000 cuts, other than pain, there was not much blood. However, The torture of so many cuts still caused the blood to pool uncontrollably. It soaked the black Overwatch Council robes Fan Xian had covered his body. It was sticky, hot, and scalding to the hand. In the autumn rain, Fan Xian gently held his thin and weak body, terrified of causing him more pain. He held his cold hand tightly, terrified that he would leave just like this. If you don't want to come back, who can make you come back? Why did you drag me to Donnie? Fan Xian said in a low and raspy voice. His dry lips had been soaked in the rain until they were white and peeling. He appeared very pitiful. Who have I worked hard for these years? Who have I not wanted you old people to be able to leave Jingdo and live a good life? I have always worked hard. You know that I know everything. Fan Xian's head lowered even more and gently leaned against the old man's wrinkled cheek. His body swayed gently in the rain, as if he was coaxing the old man in his arms to sleep. His hand suddenly tightened. The old man's hand gripped Fan Xian's hand tightly. However, all of his life force couldn't even hold one hand tightly. He didn't know whether it was because he couldn't bear to part with something or because he was afraid of something. In the wind and rain, on the ground, and in the water, he wanted to hold on to something, like a knife slowly tearing at his heart. Fan Xian's entire body was cold and terrified as he looked at the old man in his arms. He knew that he could not hold on much longer. Unconsciously, he tightened his grip on that hand until his fingers began to turn white and ache faintly. Chun Pingping's muddy and scattered gaze slowly moved through the rain. He saw the familiar royal palace, the sky covered in rain clouds, and the blurry figure of the emperor on the palace walls. However, he could not clearly see the person's face. Then, he saw Fan Xian's face beside him. A glimmer of a smile flashed through the old man's muddy but clear eyes. The old man knew that he was about to leave the world he had lived in his entire life. His eyes gradually dimmed. He could not clearly hear any sound between heaven and earth. The light in front of him also gradually transformed into strange shapes. In this instant, perhaps his legendary life flashed quickly before his eyes like a slideshow. The little eunuch, the East Sea, that woman, the Overwatch Council, the Black Knights, another woman, dead people, conspiracies, revenge. All sorts of scenes flashed before his eyes and formed a white line that no one dared to look directly at. No one knew exactly what he saw before he died and what he wanted to see the most. Was it the mud that had been kicked up by the fighting in King Cheng's manor? Was it the plum blooming in winter in Taiping Courtyard? Was it the little fish swimming freely in the shallow pond in the back courtyard of the Overwatch Council's square and sinister building? Was it the palace robes in the mountains in the north? Or was it the little boy in Danzhou who had entrusted all of his emotions and hopes for the second half of his life? Amidst the sound of wind and rain, Chun Pingping suddenly heard some sounds. It was singing. It was a graceful and familiar song. It was a song he had heard countless times in Qinggarden. Those concubines were all beautiful. Those songs were all beautiful. The old man had risen and fallen in the darkness all his life. He was cold and cruel, but he had the most gentle desire to collect and love beauty. If tragedy was to destroy the beauty of the world for others to see, then Chun Pingping's life was only to destroy what he thought was ugly and filthy. He threw himself into the ugliness and filthy, and then looked at all the beautiful things from a distance. If I hear the sound of rain, who will be happy? After climbing mountain after mountain, there is a happy song in the rain. Hearing the song, my mood will be happy. This was a song that the women of Qinggarden had once loved. In the wind and rain, it once again rang out in Chun Pingping's ears. With difficulty, he opened his eyes and looked at the people in the world. Hearing this graceful voice, his bloodless lips moved slightly. It was as if he was singing along, but no sound came out of it. Chun Pingping suddenly looked at Fan Xian and asked, "Chest?" Fan Xian gave a very ugly smile and said by the old man's ear, "It's a gun. A firearm that can kill from a long distance." This was probably the last question Chun Pingping had in his life, so he asked it at the last moment. Hearing Fan Xian's answer, the old man's eyes lit up slightly. It was as if he had not thought it would be this answer. He was slightly surprised and relieved. A gurgling sound came from his throat as he panted hurriedly. A cold and proud expression rose to his face. This thing, I also have it. Fan Xian didn't say anything. He just sat in the autumn rain and gently held him. He gently shook his head. He felt the old body in his arms grow softer and softer. The old hand he held tightly in his hand grew colder and colder. In the end, there was no longer any warmth. Chen Pingping died. He died in the arms of the little boy he loved the most in the autumn rain. Before he died, he knew the truth about the chest. His face still carried a cold, proud, and insufferably arrogant expression. Fan Xian woodenly held the gradually colder body. He lowered his head and pressed it against the old man's icy face. He quietly said a few words. Suddenly, he felt that the wind and rain that filled the sky were like knives cutting into his body. It caused him great pain and was difficult to bear. This pain burst forth from his heart and traveled to every inch of his skin. It was like a death by 1,000 cuts. In the end, it finally exploded out. On the little wooden stage in the autumn rain, a loud cry suddenly exploded. It was a cry that broke one's heart. It was a cry that tore at one's liver and pained one's lungs. It was a cry that was so sorrowful that the autumn rain didn't dare to fall. It was a cry that tens of thousands of people couldn't bear to hear. In the 20 years since his rebirth, Fan Xian had never cried to anyone. Even though there were a few times when his eyes were wet, he forcefully pushed them down. No one in this world had ever seen him cry. No one had ever seen him cry so thoroughly and with such sorrow. A myriad of emotions were all vented in this loud cry. The tears were unable to blur his face. They only washed away the remaining dust on his face that not even the autumn rain could wash away. Just like how the autumn rain could not be stopped, the tears could not be stopped either. Just like this, endless sorrow surged out of his eyes. The sorrowful cry from the small wooden platform in the execution field penetrated the autumn wind and autumn rain and spread to every corner of the royal palace. It pierced into everyone's ears and caused countless people to immediately feel grief in their hearts, a chill in their hearts. When this cry landed in some people's ears, it gave rise to a powerful sense of fear. Other than this, it was a clear signal. Old director Chun had finally died. No one knew if there were people who secretly rejoiced or let out a large breath because of this fact. However, not a single official in the wind and rain showed any emotion on their faces. Perhaps sorrow flashed through some eyes. Most of them maintained their solemnity and slight nervousness, as well as a faint sense of loss at the bottom of their hearts. One of the pillars of the Qing kingdom had snapped. The civil officials, who had been suppressed by the Overwatch Council in darkness for decades and could not catch their breath, and who were like fire and water in the court disputes, suddenly felt a chill in their hearts. The ancestor of the Overwatch Council had died, just like this. They seemed to find it difficult to accept this reality for a moment. In their eyes, it seemed that this terrifying figure covered from head to toe in black fog would never die. Countless people thought of countless scenes because of Chen Pingping's death. No one dared to deny the work Chen Pingping had done for the Qing kingdom over the decades of wind and rain. In this long scroll of history, the thick black ink used to illuminate the clear was this person and the Overwatch Council he had created. Without this ink, where would this long scroll have its spirit? When Fan Xian's cry pierced through the wind and rain and reached the top of the royal palace walls high above, no one noticed that the Qing emperor, dressed in dragon robes and imposing with an imperial aura, had made a very small movement. His entire body leaned forward slightly, only the distance of 2 fingers. A moment later, the emperor valiantly straightened his back again, maintaining the distance between his emotionless face and the execution field filled with the scent of blood in the rain. No one noticed that the emperor's hands, hidden in the sleeves of his dragon robes, were slowly clenched tightly. At this moment, he watched his old companion and servant, who had followed him for decades, die. The old man who had watched him go from an unremarkable heir to the most dazzling warrior in the world died so decisively. What did the emperor think? What did he feel? Was it a kind of emptiness that came from the depths of his heart, or a kind of anger that even he could not explain and had no idea where it came from. At the top of the royal palace walls, Yin Bingyan lowered his head deeply, even lower than all the officials beside him. His body faced the direction of the execution field. Through the curtain of rain, he could still see Sir Fan Jr.'s indifferent and wooden appearance as he held the old director's body. His body trembled slightly. He thought of the words the old director had once said to him in the square building of the Overwatch Council. "One day I'm going to die. Fan Xian will go crazy." Yin Bingyan abruptly raised his head and took a deep breath. Wiping away the rain on his face, he continued to secretly give orders to all sides. The secret agents hidden in the crowd watching the execution could act at any moment. He wanted to compress the madness that could happen next into the smallest possible area. Of course, Yin Bingyan hoped that none of this would happen. The person had died. Although the death by 1,000 cuts had not been completely completed and the executioner had been cut in half by Fan Xian with resentment, there was no need to continue. The autumn rain continued to fall miserably, but no one left the square in front of the royal palace. It was as if everyone knew what was about to happen. The ascetic monks surrounding the execution field slowly approached the little wooden stage. The straw hats on their heads blocked the rain falling from the sky and hid the original expression on their faces. It was as if Fan Xian could not sense the danger below the stage. He just sat numbly on the wooden stage. He continued to hold Chen Pingping's body and did not put down. His tears had already mixed with the rain and gradually stopped. Fan Xian suddenly stood up. However, his figure swayed slightly. It looked like these days and nights of traveling thousands of li had exhausted him. The anger and sorrow that pierced his heart made his state of mind show signs of exhaustion. However, the figure on the wooden stage swayed in the rain. This startled the hearts of the people around the wooden stage. They unconsciously took half a step back. Fan Xian indifferently held Chen Pingping's body and walked down the wooden stage. He didn't even glance at these people. It was as if they didn't exist. These people surrounded the wooden stage and waited for the order from the emperor in the royal palace. The emperor looked at the scene below the palace walls with a pale face. Complicated emotions flashed through his deep eyes. Starting from the Hanging Temple incident, his admiration for Fan Xian was built on the foundation that his son was a loyal and righteous person. Although he had not thought that Fan Xian would be able to make it back, he did not find it strange when he saw this scene. Even the emperor was not worried. In his heart, he thought Enji was a pitiful child who had been deceived by Chen Pingping, that old dog. Perhaps Enji still did not know how much Chen Pingping wanted to kill him, kill all of his sons, and cut off his line of descendants. When he looked at Fan Xian's desolate figure, the emperor could not suppress the sadness and anger he felt. He was hurt by what Fan Xian had demonstrated. He was angry that even though Chen Pingping, that old dog, was dead, he could still easily steal the heart of his favorite son, just like that woman who had died many years ago. The emperor was silent for a long time. The injury that he had forcefully suppressed also gradually split open because of the agitation in his heart. Blood seeped out his chest and onto the dragon robe he wore. It was particularly shocking. He shook out his sleeves and left the top of the palace walls with a cold expression. Below the royal palace, Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping's body and left the little wooden stage soaked in the rain and blood. He walked toward the west side of the square. His steps were particularly slow and heavy. Until now, he still did not glance toward the top of the palace walls. The emperor had already left. No one in the world dared to block Fan Xian's path. Everyone unconsciously opened up a path. The crowd was like the surface of the sea being cut open by a sword. The waves gradually rose and opened up a path through which reefs could be seen. In the rain, Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping and left. Who was a great hero? How could one be called a hero? This was a question that everyone had different opinions about. In this story, all the people who were loyal to their own way of thinking were actually extraordinary people. It just depended on how much they were willing to pay for this way of thinking. The more they were willing to pay, the more they were shocking enough. In particular, the word heroic was actually only heroic and did not involve anything else. When it came to men, one could not be called a man just because they had asterisk asterisk. It was also not possible to be spiritually impotent. Although Chun Ping was a eunuch, he was actually an idealist. He was a simple person, a man with a gun. He was more manly than most men. The last sentence he said, "I have that thing too," was my opinion of Chun Ping ever since I wrote this story. Chapter 705. The first 2 rains of early autumn came and went abruptly with an inexplicable feeling. It seemed that the first rain was just to welcome Chun Ping back, and the second rain was to send Chun Ping away. When everything on the execution field in front of the imperial palace came to an end, the misty autumn rain stopped just like that. The dark clouds in the sky were blown away, revealing an extremely high, faint, and clear sky. Other than the wet rain in the streets and on the black bricks, everything returned to normal. The people of Jingdo saw such a shocking scene, but no one dared to discuss anything. They silently dispersed along the various streets. The officials in front of the palace gates looked at each other. They didn't know what to do next. The emperor had already returned to the palace. The little duke carried the old director's body and left. The rainwater flowing all over the ground did not converge into one, making them very confused. After thousands of years of traveling back to Jingdo, Fan Xian and the 500 Black Knights had already broken countless Qing laws and Overwatch Council rules. Furthermore, when he had broken into Jingdo, he had casually killed so many court officials. Additionally, he had caused a disturbance on the execution field in front of the emperor. Logically speaking, this was an unforgivable crime. However, the emperor had not spoken. Who could punish Fan Xian for his crimes? Who dared to punish Fan Xian for his crimes? Who the scholar walked down from the top of the royal palace walls. Many officials bowed to him. This scholar had maintained his silence. He looked at the faint traces of blood on the wooden stage that had been washed away by the autumn rain. His brows suddenly twitched. Turning his head back, he saw the former scholar, Shu Wu, who seemed to have aged a dozen years in an instant, leave desolately along the foot of the city walls. He did not greet these people, who the scholar's heart dimmed slightly. He knew he could not be controlled by such emotions. Sir, he had already entered the palace. He had to stay here and sort out his funeral. His gaze slowly swept across the faces of the officials of the 6 ministries, 3 temples, and 3 courts. Calmly, he said, "The great punishment has ended. Open the city gates. Everything will be as usual." Hearing these words, the officials in front of the royal palace involuntarily let out a big breath. They had been terrified about how to handle Sir Fan Jr.'s matter. Looking at the situation, at least for a short period of time, the emperor would be able to control his anger and not hand such a dangerous task to his officials to handle. But the scholar did not care about these officials' reactions. His eyes narrowed slightly. He did not see anyone from the Overwatch Council in the 6 ministries, 3 temples, and 3 courts. This was normal. The heads of the 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council were all locked up in the prison. Sir Yin Jr. seemed to have quietly left a long time ago. It was not only the Overwatch Council that had been controlled from the inside and outside. A heavy expression flashed through the scholar's brows. He knew that there were also people in the royal palace who had been controlled, such as Lady Ning and King Jing, who had risked their lives to ask the emperor for mercy this morning. They were both under house arrest in the royal palace, and their situation was unknown. Furthermore, after Miss Fan had treated His Majesty last night, it seemed that she had not come out. Thinking of these things, and the tens of thousands of Qing elite troops still stationed outside the Overwatch Council, a chill rose in the scholar's heart. He knew he had to immediately find Fan Xian and say something to this little duke who had the power and courage to oppose the royal palace. The noon sun shone fiercely on the Lu Jing River outside Jingdo. The river water was clear and cold. It was only slightly warm, but no cheerful fog rose. Across the river was an elegant courtyard that stood aloof from the world. It had gray-white walls, green and yellow bamboo, and a threatening coldness. The water on the tiles had been left wet by the sun, but there was an additional sense of the summer heat of turning back time. In the stifling heat of early autumn, A black carriage sped past the bamboo sedan beside the Lujing River and stopped steadily in front of the courtyard. This courtyard had been Yi Qingmei's former residence, the place where the eldest princess had died and where Fan Xian had once bowed to the river several times. After the Yi family incident, it had been taken into the palace treasury property by the royal family and became a courtyard. However, over the years, the emperor rarely came here. Furthermore, no concubine or prince dared to be so blind as to ask to temporarily live there. Thus, it had been empty for over 20 years. 3 years ago, when the eldest princess was planning the Jingdo incident, for some reason, she temporarily lived there for a few days. Because this courtyard was quiet and rarely visited, and because of the cold history it carried, it made everyone have the urge to keep a respectful distance. Thus, the internal court did not look after this place with much care or strictness. There were only 4 royal guards stationed there. Seeing the black carriage disregard the royal seal outside the courtyard and charge directly in, the guards' expressions changed. They walked forward, but before they could say anything, they were restrained by a group of people surging out from behind the black carriage. They were disarmed and bound. An Overwatch Council official walked forward and silently pulled open the curtain. The sound of footsteps rang out slightly. Covered in rain, the pale-faced Fan Xian carried Chen Pingping's body down from the carriage. The rainwater on his body dripped down his black clothes and the Overwatch Council uniform on the old man in his arms, making a pitter-patter. The door to Taiping courtyard opened. Fan Xian did not glance at his subordinates. Solemnly, he walked in. With a creak, the door closed behind him. The Overwatch Council officials immediately spread out and controlled all the important positions at the end of the bamboo bridge. They watched their surroundings cautiously. After a while, a hurried and slightly chaotic sound of hooves rang out. Hundreds of exhausted black riders rode over along the road on the other side of the Lujing River. Immediately after, another thunderous sound of hooves stopped a bit further away. No one knew if it was the Jingdo garrison or the Imperial Army. Finally, a black carriage drove over and stopped on the other side of the bamboo bridge. An official with a frosty expression stepped out of the carriage. It was Yin Bingyun. He did not cross the bridge. He only looked calmly at the Overwatch Council officials at the other end of the bridge. Other than a few members of the Qinian unit scattered throughout Jingdo, most of the Overwatch Council officials who had followed Fan Xian to Taiping Courtyard were officials of the First Bureau. With the help of the palace, Yin Bingyun temporarily controlled the situation in the square and sinister building of the Overwatch Council. However, he was unable to control all 8 bureaus of the Overwatch Council, particularly the First Bureau. Fan Xian had once been powerful and impressive in the First Bureau. The officials of the First Bureau all treated Fan Xian like an ancestor. Not long after the curtain fell on the show in front of the royal palace, and Fan Xian left the square in front of the palace with Chen Pingping's body, an official of the First Bureau drove a black carriage to receive him. Yin Bingyun narrowed his eyes and looked at his colleagues at the other end of the bridge. He did not feel anything strange about the high prestige Fan Xian had in the council, particularly in the First Bureau. He only felt it was strange. The emperor had also sent people to keep an eye on the First Bureau. News did not flow smoothly. Fan Xian had just returned to Jingdo. How did these First Bureau officials know? Furthermore, they had so coincidentally received him. This was truly puzzling. Yin Bingyun did not know that the young mistress of the Fan Manor had reacted as soon as the news of Chen Pingping's attempt to assassinate the emperor came out. She had already made preparations for her husband and had secretly maintained contact with the First Bureau the entire time. When Fan Xian rode alone into the execution field, the people of the First Bureau had already begun to move. As for the hundreds of exhausted Black Knights who could not be underestimated, they had received Fan Xian's earlier orders and were set to gather at Taiping Courtyard. Before Fan Xian entered the capital, he had thought it through. Regardless of whether or not he could save the old cripple, he and these people would probably have to meet at Taiping Courtyard. Yin Bingyun stood at the head of the bridge in silence for a long time. He tidied up his wet official robes and walked toward the bridge alone. The creaking sound continued. He finally reached the other end of the bridge. Under the wary, hateful, and disdainful gazes of the First Bureau officials and secret agents, he bowed and said in a heavy voice, "Yin Bingyun of the Fourth Bureau requests an audience with the director." Fan Xian didn't know that Yin Bingyun had already appeared outside Taiping Courtyard. He was certain that someone was coming to see him and persuade him. He could even accurately understand how many people followed behind him as he walked out of Jingdo step by step. How many of the Qing Kingdom's elite troops were gathered outside Taiping Courtyard, waiting for the success of his persuasion. Whether it was successful or not, this was all the emperor's will, right? He didn't think about this and couldn't be bothered to think about it. He only felt very tired and exhausted. His body was very empty. The jinqi that was usually as abundant as mountains and rivers seemed to have been spat out in that cry earlier. The turbid air in his chest had been spat out, and the jinqi had also been spat out. All that was left was emptiness. Fan Xian felt that his footsteps had never been as heavy as they were today. His body had never been as weak as it was today. The old man in his arms was clearly very light, but why was he becoming heavier and heavier? So heavy that he almost couldn't hold him anymore. His slightly damp hair fell on his forehead. He carried Chen Ping across the grass, past the flowering tree and the little lake. He came to a secluded place. There were flowers on the wall. He gently plucked a small yellow flower that was curled up and blooming. Then he stretched out his hand and gently pressed on a corner of the flower wall. With a few creaking sounds, a hole slowly appeared on the ground. There were stone steps leading down, and it wasn't too far away. At this time, the sunlight from the sky could completely reflect on the dry stone slabs below. Presumably, it was no secret to the old people back then that there was a secret room in Taiping Courtyard. Even the young eldest princess had once found one in the courtyard. After the Yi family incident, the emperor should have come to the courtyard to investigate the whereabouts of the box. However, he did not find it. Additionally, he always had strange feelings toward the courtyard, so he never came again. For Fan Xian, this secret passage was very familiar. Many years ago, after he had opened the box, Uncle Wu Zhu had once brought him to Taiping Courtyard. Following this passage down, he had found the bullets that the fire stick needed the most. Step by step, he walked down as if he was walking into the netherworld. In reality, it was just a secret room about 30 feet off the ground. The room was clean and dry. There were no other furnishings or treasures. There were only a few chairs and a few coffins. Fan Xian placed one hand on the edge of the coffin and used a little force to lift the lid. He then carefully placed the old man's thin and weak body in his arms inside. Taking out a small porcelain pillow, he carefully placed it behind his head. Looking at the silk inside the coffin, Fan Xian tilted his head slightly and did not close it for him. Chen Pingping's eyes were tightly closed. His naked body was only covered by the Overwatch Council robes that Fan Xian had taken off. Fan Xian stood by the coffin and quietly looked at his thin cheeks and sunken eyes. He suddenly felt that this completely black clothing was more suitable than those beautiful silks. The completely black clothing was the Overwatch Council's official robes. What Fan Xian had taken off was the uniform of the director of the Overwatch Council. In Fan Xian's opinion, Chen Pingping's life was difficult to say. Presumably, he would like to die as the director of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian stood quietly by the coffin and looked at the sleeping Chen Pingping. He thought of how, on the execution field earlier in the autumn rain, this old man seemed to have gradually fallen asleep in his arms. Before he fell asleep, he held his hand tightly. You shouldn't be afraid, right? Looking at the old and pale face, Fan Xian suddenly thought of many things. When he was very young, this old man, who liked to put a wool blanket on his knees, had teacher Fei Jie teach him so that he could learn the ability to protect himself in this dangerous world. From a young age, he had familiarized himself with all of the rules and structure of the Overwatch Council. Probably from the day he was born, the old man had already decided that he was going to leave the Overwatch Council, which he viewed as his most precious treasure to him. Fan Xian thought of the first time he saw Chen Pingping. It was in that dark room in the Overwatch Council. It was clearly the first time the two of them had met, but when he looked at the old cripple in the wheelchair, It was like seeing an elder he hadn't seen for a long time. A natural closeness wrapped around the two of them. That day, Fan Xian had lowered his head and gently hugged the thin and weak Qin Pingping. He pressed his face against it, just as he had hugged and pressed his face against it today. Watching the fish by the shallow pond, discussing the world, gently playing with the flowers, and dancing in the two wheelchairs in Qin Garden were probably things that could never appear again, right? He couldn't think about it anymore. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly and immediately opened them. Lowering his body, he picked up the cowering little yellow flower in his hand and gently pinched it into the white hair at Qin Pingping's temples. After a long silence, Fan Xian didn't say anything more. He closed the lid of the coffin and picked up the large nails he had prepared at the side. Aiming them at the edge of the coffin lid, he channeled his qi into his palms and brought them down. A series of muffled thuds rang out. Fan Xian silently brought his palms down one by one and hammered all of the large nails down. He nailed the entire coffin firmly and shut the old man in another world, a world he would never be able to touch again. After doing all this, Fan Xian looked at the black coffin in a daze. This was only a temporary solution. There would come a day when Fan Xian would send the old man back to his hometown or a place no one knew about. He would not let him stay forever near this dark Jingdo. Although this was Taiping Courtyard and presumably Qin Pingping liked to live here, it was still too close to Jingdo and the royal palace. Fan Xian's body swayed slightly. He felt a boundless tiredness and exhaustion begin to surge into his heart. He sat down on the tall wooden chair beside him. Placing his legs on the side of the chair, he buried his head deeply between his knees. His hands hung weakly by his side. The cut on his right palm from a nail began to bleed. The blood dripped onto the ground. Fan Xian sat with his head buried. He didn't know how long he sat. The rainwater that had accumulated on the lawn of Taiping Courtyard above his head began to flow down the stone steps, wetting layer by layer and cooling layer by layer. The sunlight slowly moved in the sky. The light in the dark underground room also flickered between bright and dark. No one knew whether it was the angle of the light or the thickness of the clouds that caused all of this. A sliver of sound traveled into Fan Xian's ears. He slowly raised his head from between his knees and walked down the chair. Glancing at the silent and dark coffin again, he walked up the wet stone steps. After a strange sound, the secret door above the stone room was tightly shut. No more sunlight or running water could seep in. The place returned to peace and darkness. Fan Xian walked along the grassy path beside the lake toward the door of Taiping Courtyard. When he was not far from the wooden door, he heard the low voice of a subordinate reporting. A complicated expression flashed across Fan Xian's cold face. He quietly said something and then sat down on a broken tree in the courtyard. The wooden door opened. Yin Bingyan walked in and stood in front of Fan Xian with his head lowered. He didn't speak for a long time. Perhaps he didn't know how to start. Starting from the day the palace began to move, you should have been involved from beginning to end. I don't want to miss out on any details. Fan Xian sat tiredly on the broken tree root with his right hand on his knee. His face was unhealthily pale. Yin Bingyan glanced at his right hand and found it was bleeding. His heart jumped slightly, but he didn't explain too much. Instead, he calmly said, "On the second day, I was summoned into the palace. After receiving an edict, I began to make arrangements. As for Scholar, he capturing Gouda in Dazhou, and the emperor using this matter to keep the director in Dazhou, and then using the Jingdo garrison to capture him. I only know the general situation and not the details." "Tell me the details you know." Yin Bingyan looked at Fan Xian, who had his head lowered. He found that Sir Fan Jr. was different from any other time. His facial expression was calm, so calm that it made one's heart tremble. It was not a reaction a normal person should have. From that morning, when the Jingdo garrison escorted the black carriage into the capital, to the argument in the royal study in the royal palace, to the emperor being heavily injured, to Qin Pingping being injured by the porcelain cup and being sent to the Overwatch Council prison, Yin Bingyun didn't hide any details. He even clearly explained the ugly role he had played in all of it. Fan Xian was silent for a moment. He then slowly raised his head and looked at him. "Then, why are you following me now?" Do you want to drag that old cripple back and cut him a few more times? Or do you want him to die without a burial? Yin Bingyun didn't need to control his emotions in front of him. A sliver of unfeigned sorrow appeared on his face. In a raspy voice, he said, I had to see you. I had to guarantee that you wouldn't go crazy. Was going crazy? Rebellion? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly. His laughter was full of coldness. Aren't the Jingdo garrison and Imperial Army troops outside used to do this? At this moment, smoke and dust were faintly discernible outside the courtyard. It had clearly just rained, yet it was dry. Who knew how many troops were lying in ambush outside the Taiping courtyard, and how many aces were used to suppress Fan Xian? Yin Bingyun valiantly controlled his state of mind. Looking at Fan Xian, he coldly said, No matter what, the old director is already gone. No matter how angry you are, you can't change anything. Even if you can escape Jingdo, what can you do? Deng Ziyu is in Shiliang. Su Wan Mao is in the palace treasury in North Min. Xia Qifei is in Suzhou, and the generals of the Qinian unit and the most powerful officials and secret agents in the council have all been sent out by me to places you control the most. Once you leave Jingdo, you can once again gather 60% of the Overwatch Council's power. But what can you do? Fan Xian looked at him coldly and didn't say a word. Very well. Presently, you're the master of Dongyi's sword hut. You have countless swordsmen under your command. Additionally, the Great Prince is currently leading 10,000 elite soldiers stationed in Dongyi. However, those 10,000 elite soldiers may not be completely under the Great Prince's control. Taking 10,000 steps back, would the Great Prince rebel against the Emperor because of you or the old director? Yin Bingyun's lips were a bit dry. His throat was a bit congested with blood, but he still forcefully said, The heir, Hongcheng, is in Dingzhou. He is your best friend. Even if he raises troops for you, would the Dingzhou army listen to him? It has to be said, in this world, only you have the power to stand against the Emperor. But you are still not a match for the Emperor. Are you done? Fan Xian looked at him with narrowed eyes and tiredly shook his head. If you want to convince me, shouldn't you take out the letter Qin Pingping personally wrote for you? Yin Bingyun's body shook. He had thought that what he had done within the Overwatch Council these few days would anger Fan Xian. He had not thought that from the beginning. Fan Xian had already found out everything. Fan Xian looked at him. Even if you took it out, I wouldn't want to see it. It is nothing more than to take care of the big picture and prevent the Overwatch Council from losing control for a moment and being forcefully wiped out by the Emperor. Thus, you must become the Emperor's second dog and forcefully preserve this council. In order to win that man's trust, you must do some things. I know you don't feel good and comfortable. Fan Xian looked at the slightly absent-minded Yin Bingyun and coldly said, But you brought this upon yourself. Do you think this is the joy of enduring humiliation? Wrong. You're just a fool. You're just going to listen to what Qin Pingping wants to do. If he wants you to kill him, you kill him. The old director is thinking on behalf of the thousands of lives of the Overwatch Council and the people of the world, Yin Bingyun said in a slightly raspy voice. Even if I suffer some misunderstandings and become a thorn in the side of the council officials, so what? Do I have to watch as the world falls into chaos? Why can't the world fall into chaos? Thinking on behalf of the people? Fan Xian suddenly laughed strangely. There was a coughing sound in his laughter. He coughed up a few threads of blood. How many of these people have thought on behalf of them? I don't forgive you. Fan Xian looked at Yin Bingyun calmly. Each word he said made one tremble in fear. Everything for the Qing kingdom, everything for the Emperor, everything for the world. This is your attitude, not mine. For the people I care about. So what if tens of thousands of people die? You didn't do all of this for me. So I don't forgive you. Yin Bingyun knew that under Fan Xian's gentle exterior was a heart that loved and hated intensely. After a long silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, I don't need anyone's forgiveness. The old director's choice is the same as mine, so I did it. For the Qing kingdom, I can do anything. Very good. Only like this can you become a good official of the Emperor. For those dead people, he might be a good emperor. Fan Xian slowly stood. For me, neither he nor you are people I can place a sliver of trust in. In your hearts, there are things more important than companions. King Jing and Lady Ning are under house arrest in the palace. The young lady of the Fan family is also in the palace, Yin Bingyun said hurriedly as he suddenly felt cold. Fan Xian's voice in reply was mocking and cold. For the emperor, this is a matter of course. Watching Fan Xian walk tiredly toward the wooden door, Yin Bingyun's heart suddenly tightened. A difficult-to-suppress fear surged in his heart. It was not fear for himself. Rather, he was worried about Fan Xian. In a loud voice, he asked, "Where are you going?" Fan Xian's hand froze slightly on the wooden door. He didn't turn his head. Tiredly, he said, "Going home to sleep." Walking out of the wooden door of Taiping Courtyard, he looked at the officials of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council at the end of the bridge as if they were facing a great enemy. He looked at the hundreds of travel-worn Black Knights on the other side of the bridge who were forcefully suppressing their exhaustion and barely forming a defensive formation. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. On the other side of the bridge, at the other end of the green and yellow autumn forest, were the troops the emperor had used to suppress him. How could the subordinates he had hurriedly brought back to the capital stand against them? The bright sun dazzled his eyes. Only now did he realize that exhaustion and sorrow could harm humans to such an extent. His steps were weak as he walked across the bamboo bridge. He gently gave a few orders to the subordinates who were still fighting to the death to follow him in such a tense moment. The deputy commander of the Black Knights and the officials of the First Bureau were silent for a long time. They knew that the little duke was thinking about their lives. Without another word, they knelt on one knee on the ground. No one knew whether they were kneeling to the young director in front of them or the old director buried in Taiping Courtyard. After they knelt, the hundreds of people mixed together and retreated west along the beautiful and quiet Liushi River. Yin Bingyun, who had followed silently behind Fan Xian the entire time, glanced at those people with a complicated gaze. He followed him across the bridge and onto the road. He then saw the thousands of fully armored riders spread across the fields on the other side of the road. These riders were lined up densely, and their power was astonishing. Fan Xian looked expressionlessly at these powerful martial forces. With his hands behind his back, he slowly walked over. Under countless wary gazes, he walked in front of the commander. In a raspy voice, he said, "Have the scouts and ambushing soldiers withdraw. I want not a single one of my people hurt." Yizhong narrowed his eyes slightly. A cold light flashed through them. "I've caught a cold. It's been 2 days. I can't take it much longer. I've taken large amounts of medicine, but my entire body is still sore. My head is dizzy, and I feel very uncomfortable." There are a lot of good things missing in the book review section because the leader has also been sick recently. I really feel sorry for the friends who worked so hard to write reviews. If you have a long review, please send it to my email, xfsdz@hotmail.com. Also, thank you to the brothers in Shuemu who cast their illegitimate children. It's been a long time since I've gone diving. Yesterday, my thoughts jumped and I want to take a look. In the end, I saw the votes for idealism and rations. You like it? I'm very grateful. Chapter 706. The head of the Bureau of Military Affairs of the Qing Kingdom, the foremost person in the military under the Emperor Commander Yizhong, had personally led elite soldiers to Taiping Courtyard to suppress, monitor, and control Fan Xian. It had to be said that the Qing court and royal palace maintained a high level of respect and caution toward Fan Xian. This respect and caution was expressed through strength. Fan Xian's face was haggard and slightly pale. Streaks of muddy marks appeared very eye-catching on his handsome face. They were probably marks formed by the rain and dust from 1,000 li. He looked at Yizhong's slightly cold gaze on his horse. His entire person appeared wooden and indifferent. It was as if he did not see Yizhong and the thousands of fully armored riders. For people at Fan Xian and Yizhong's level of strength, they knew that on the plains, no matter how powerful an ace, it would be impossible to escape the pursuit of thousands of elite riders unless they had already entered the realm of a great grandmaster. However, this place was still on the outskirts of Jingdao. The dense forests, clear rivers, and houses were still densely packed. If Fan Xian truly gave up everything in Jingdou and fled like a giant bird into the woods, these thousands of elite soldiers would probably not be able to catch him for a while. The emperor had ordered Yizhong to personally lead troops to deal with this matter because he had thought of this. Among these thousands of elite riders, there were many aces from the military. Most importantly, there was Yizhong, who could face Fan Xian head-on. He was one of the few aces in the Qing kingdom who stood above the 9th level. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Yizhong on his horse. Suddenly, his heart jumped. He thought of another matter and couldn't help smiling self-mockingly. In the beginning, there were 3 countries. Dongyi had the most 9th level aces. However, the Qing kingdom conquered the world with its knives and horses, so aces emerged in an endless stream. They had the most aces between the 7th and 8th level. There were even a number of aces who had entered the 9th level in Jingdou. However, all of this had become history. The Tiger Guards, who had gathered the most 7th and 8th level aces, had all sacrificed themselves to the vicious sword of Dongyi because of the emperor's caution toward the previous minister of revenue, Fan Jian. The aces of the military had all died in the Jingdou rebellion 3 years ago. Qin Yi and his son had both died in front of the royal palace. There was also old eunuch Hong, who had fallen on Dong Mountain, and the Qing temple's great priest and second priest who had died one after the other. Because of the emperor's schemes and paranoia, the top aces of the Qing kingdom had unknowingly been decreasing. Now, a large gap had appeared. In order to suppress Fan Xian, a superior 9th level figure, there was no one to send. They had to send the top person in the military, Yizhong, personally. I'm very surprised that the heir to the High Duke can still smile. Yizhong had already slowly restrained the coldness in his eyes and said calmly, I was just thinking of a question. If even you and Gong Jian died, the emperor, who else would be trustworthy? The corners of Fan Xian's mouth twitched slightly as he spoke in a raspy voice. Yizhong's heart trembled slightly. He knew that Fan Xian had seen the present flaws in the Qing kingdom's martial power in a glance. Although the Qing Iron Riders were still unparalleled in the world, regardless of whether it was the Dingzhou army, the Yinjing camp, or the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army scattered across the borders who had once belonged to the Great Prince, they were all tigers and wolves on the battlefield. When it came to a small group of elites led by a strong warrior, it was difficult for the Qing kingdom to find an ace they could rely on. All the warriors in the world are in my hands. Fan Xian looked at Yizhong and slowly said. I don't care about the edict the emperor gave you earlier. I only know that if you don't immediately pull back the scouts and riders you sent out, there will be many scenes you don't want to see. All the warriors in the world are in my hands. How arrogant were these words? All the land under heaven belonged to the king. All the officials under heaven belonged to the king. As the most powerful emperor in the world, the Qing emperor should have the loyalty of most of the powerful warriors in the world. However, the situation had changed. Regardless of whether it was luck or coincidence, Yizhong had to admit that most of the truly powerful aces in the world had fallen into Fan Xian's hands. Although Yizhong did not know the truth of the assassination in the Hanging Temple, the scene on the execution field earlier made him certain that the true aces in the Overwatch Council, such as the mysterious head of the 6th Bureau and the legendary younger brother of Siga Jian, would follow Fan Xian's orders blindly. Most importantly, there were 13 disciples of the Sword Hut. Other than Yun Jilan, who had already become the master of Dongyi, there were 11 other 9th level aces. The emperor has not given you a clear edict, Yizhong said in a heavy voice. But those Black Knights and the 1st Bureau officials who followed you out of the capital have broken Qing law and are conspirators in rebellion. Do you think the court will let them live? It is me who wants to protect their lives. Fan Xian lowered his head tiredly. He felt that negotiating with Yizhong here was truly tiring. Slowly, he said, You are a smart person. You know what to do. The emperor is currently angry. I heard he is also injured. I'm afraid it would not be wise to give an edict at this time. It is very difficult for me to control my emotions. I think you would not want to truly drive me crazy. Once I go crazy, it will not be good for you, me, the officials and people of the Qin court, or even that person in the palace. Fan Xian's body was hunched as he shook his head. You know what my bottom line is? Starting from the old cripple all the way to me, the style of the Overwatch Council is to protect our own. We will not allow our people to be harmed. I understand, but this is defying an edict. Yi Zhong calmly looked at the messy hair on Fan Xian's forehead. I am an official of the Qin Kingdom. For all officials who break the law and rebel, I have the duty to capture and kill them. Don't say such useless things. Fan Xian waved his hand tiredly. There's no one else here right now. If you want to ensure the Dingzhou army's safety for 1,000 years, you'd better make a decision quickly. Yi Zhong and Fan Xian stood far in front of the riders. No one could hear their conversation. Even Yin Bingyun, who had been following Fan Xian the entire time, stood quietly by the black carriage and did not move forward. Yi Zhong thought silently for a long time. He then said, "Even if I let them go right now, the Black Knights under your command have been exhausted to the extreme. Regardless of whether you have them go to Shiliang to join Hongcheng or Dongyi to join the Great Prince, the soldiers stationed in the various provinces and counties along the way." Speaking to this point, Yi Zhong suddenly stopped and sighed in his heart. Knowing the inside story, he knew the court's arrangements these days. In the intelligence reports, Fan Xian was clearly far away outside Yinjing a few days ago. Who knew that he would rush back to Jingdou today? Thinking of this Qing military ace couldn't help but feel a sense of shock in his heart. He could not understand how Fan Xian had flown across thousands of li and brought hundreds of Black Knights back to Jingdou. As long as you don't personally act, those provincial soldiers cannot stop my people, Fan Xian said in a raspy voice. As long as I am willing to go with you, the emperor will not be angry at you for going easy on them. Yi Zhong was silent for a long time, then suddenly said, "That's true. As long as you are willing to return to the capital, the emperor's anger will lessen greatly." "See, isn't this a very simple matter?" Fan Xian said this expressionlessly. He then turned his head and walked directly into the black carriage Yin Bingyun was leading. Letting down the curtain, he closed his eyes and began to rest. The carriage jolted slightly and began to move forward on the road. Thousands of Qing elite riders seemed to be escorting as they followed the black carriage slowly toward Jingdou. They entered Jingyang Gate again and traveled on the quiet and austere street. Fan Xian, who had been resting with his eyes closed in the carriage, suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Are we going into the palace?" "No." Yi Zhong sat on the horse and straightened his not-so-tall figure. Calmly, he replied, "The emperor did not give an order. He only forbids you from leaving the capital." "Very good. Then I'll go home," Fan Xian said quietly as he closed his eyes again. Yin Bingyun, who was responsible for driving the carriage, had a slightly serious expression. He pulled on the rope and followed the fork in the road at the entrance of the salt market toward the south of the city. Some people in the dark followed the black carriage closely. Yi Zhong's subordinate riders also sent a group of people to catch up. Yi Zhong himself stood at the end of the street and did not make any movements. There were already people on the street. Although the scene on the execution field in the autumn rain had already spread like wildfire among the people, it was, after all, a distant matter and could not truly affect the lives of the people. Thus, life in Jingdou returned to normal following the end of the autumn rain. The people walking under the eaves and on the side of the road had long been herded to the two sides of the street by the soldiers. They watched this scene woodenly and looked at the black carriage surrounded by soldiers. Very easily, they guessed the true identity of the important figure in the carriage. For a moment, nervousness, excitement, confusion, worry, and many other emotions flashed through their eyes. Yi Zhong stood on the horse and watched with an indifferent expression as the black carriage slowly drove away in the direction of the south of the city. His heart felt unusually heavy. Logically speaking, the order to capture Fan Xian and bring him back to Jingdou and forbid him from leaving the capital had already been accomplished. However, he still could not relax. For one, under Fan Xian's naked and calm threat, He had no choice but to give up on the pursuit of the Black Knights, traversing the fertile lands of the Qing Kingdom and the officials of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council who dared to defy the Emperor's edict. After he entered the palace in a moment, he didn't know what kind of ferocious rage he would receive from the Emperor. The coldest, hardest, and heaviest stone pressing down on his heart was Fan Xian's expression along the way. Yi Zhong knew that it was not him who had captured Fan Xian and brought him back to Jingdou. Rather, Fan Xian had followed him back to Jingdou. What chilled his heart was that Fan Xian had no intention of entering the palace to see the Emperor. Regardless of whether Fan Xian angrily criticized the Emperor or explained something to the Emperor, it was actually more comforting than Fan Xian's current indifference. That kind of indifference actually contained anger towards his majesty and suppressed coldness, as well as a kind of disregard for imperial power. Yi Zhong didn't know why Fan Xian had the courage to do this. He knew that the Cold War between the Emperor and Fan Xian had just begun. Perhaps the Emperor, who was currently recovering, was waiting in the palace for his illegitimate son to enter the palace to explain something or roar about something. However, Fan Xian had made all of the Emperor's hopes and predictions come to nothing. Yi Zhong slowly lowered his head and thought of Fan Xian's calm and powerful words outside Taiping courtyard earlier. He couldn't help but shake his head sadly. He had been forced to concede under Fan Xian's cold pressure. This proved that Fan Xian already had the power to directly oppose the power of the Qing military. Without a doubt, such power added many variables to the relationship between the Emperor and Fan Xian. Yi Zhong could even guess what the Emperor and Fan Xian were thinking. The Emperor would never voluntarily issue an edict for Fan Xian to enter the palace. He would wait for Fan Xian to enter the palace, and Fan Xian would never voluntarily enter the palace. He would wait for the man on the throne to speak first. This was the so-called contest of attitude, intentions, and willpower. The foundation of this contest lay in the difference in power between the two sides. More importantly, it lay in the powerful and icy hearts of both sides. Who would beat first? Yi Zhong took a deep breath. The expression on his face recovered its solemn calmness. Squeezing his horse, he prepared to enter the palace to report. The battle between this father and son was not something he, as an official, could interfere with. The reason the Dingzhou army had interfered was because of the Emperor's edict. It was clear that the Emperor's attitude toward Fan Xian, his illegitimate son, was completely different than that of his other sons. As the head of the Qing military, Yi Zhong only hoped that this battle would end peacefully or as quickly as possible. It wouldn't be like the autumn rain these 2 days, always making one feel cold and uneasy. The carriage stopped in front of the main gate of the Fan Manor in the south of the city. The street was completely silent. The 2 rain-soaked stone lions outside the gate stared with wide eyes, angrily and uneasily at the people walking around them. The tightly shut main gate immediately opened. A few manor guard carrying knives surged out and stood under the carriage. Fan Xian walked down from the carriage. He didn't glance at Yin Bingyun on the shaft. He only lightly swept his gaze around his surroundings. He easily saw that there were many spies watching. They were probably people sent by the palace. They were probably people raised by the 13 Yamens or the Supreme Court. Further away, the Overwatch Council secret agents were still there. A warm smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. In terms of surveillance, even if the entire court worked together, they might not be a match for the Overwatch Council. It looked like the secret agents he controlled were still in his hands and not yet controlled by the Emperor. He walked up the steps. Yin Bingyun sat on the shaft and sighed. He was just about to leave when he suddenly heard a sentence. "I probably won't be able to manage the council for much longer." Fan Xian didn't turn his head. One of his arms was supported by a wife. Tiredly and with a glimmer of self-mockery, he said, "Originally, I didn't manage it for too long. However, I hope you won't make the mistakes you've made in the past." The reason the Overwatch Council is so united is not because of clear rewards and punishments. Rather, it is because we protect our own. Probably many people have already been imprisoned. In the future, it will be impossible for these old fellows to continue staying in their positions in the 8 bureaus. His back slowly straightened. If they've been taken, then they've been taken. But you have to ensure that they can live. If even they die, no matter how much you protect this stupid council, it will be meaningless. Do you understand? Yin Bingyun was silent for a moment. He then nodded, not caring whether or not Fan Xian could see it. Fan Xian sighed. With the support of his wife, he stepped into the Fan Manor's high doorstep. The moment he entered the Fan Manor, a familiar aura hit him in the face. It wrapped around Fan Xian's tired body and made him feel sleepy. This was probably the so-called power of home. However, Fan Xian forced himself to stand straight and walked on the stone path. He even left his wife's support. There were hidden weapons buried all around the manor. There were also guards walking solemnly. Everything was orderly and filled with a sense of sternness. This was the tradition of the Fan Manor. No matter how turbulent the outside world was, there would never be too many holes on the inside. During the Jingdo Rebellion 3 years ago, the Fan Manor had made ample preparations. Now, the Fan Manor had also made preparations. This tradition was a rule set by his father while he was still alive. No matter how chaotic Jingdo became, to drag the Fan Manor down would require at least a forceful attack by hundreds of soldiers. Fan Xian looked at all of this with satisfaction. He knew that Wonder had made ample preparations. Thus, he had to maintain his valiance and let the people of the Fan Manor, who saw him as their backbone, know that their young master had not fallen yet. Walking past the flower bed and into the back garden, he saw the gentle woman at the door to the flower hall. Fan Xian gazed at her and forced a smile. "I'm back." A mist gradually rose in Lin Wan-er's eyes, but she forcefully suppressed it. She had also just returned from the palace. Taking a few steps forward, she grabbed Fan Xian's icy hand and smiled sweetly. "It's good that you're back. Sleep first. You probably haven't slept for a few days." "I haven't slept for 6 days. I didn't think I would be able to make it." Fan Xian's heart ached a little. He forced a smile and placed the weight of his body on his wife's shoulder. Walking toward the bedroom, he said in a warm voice, "These 2 days must have been hard on you." "Not hard at all." Lin Wan-er helped him into the bedroom. She found that there were some bloodstains on his palm. Her heart dimmed slightly, but she didn't say anything. She only had him sit down by the bed. Then, she ordered the servants to quickly bring hot water and help him wash his face. She also placed a copper basin used to wash his feet at his feet. Lin Wan sat on a little stool and helped him take off his shoes and socks. Only then did she realize that the many days of hard running, although he was riding a horse, had already made Fan Xian's feet and shoes seem to be connected. Particularly, the soles of his feet that were stepping on the stirrups had a deep, bloody mark. Lin Wan-er's heart ached. She carefully placed Fan Xian's feet into the basin of hot water. Fan Xian sighed. She didn't know whether it was because he was too comfortable or too sad. The outside of the courtyard is filled with people. There's no way to go in. Lin lowered her head and gently rubbed his feet as she spoke quietly. The courtyard in this sentence referred to the square and sinister building of the Overwatch Council. When I left the capital earlier, some daring people from the First Bureau followed me out of the city. Fan Xian looked at the top of his wife's head and smiled warmly. "I know it was you who told them. I've already arranged for them to leave. Don't worry. As for the courtyard, at least for now, the Emperor will not allow me to contact them." Lin Wan-er's hand froze slightly. She was worried about Fan Xian, but she was also thinking about whether or not she should say that matter. A moment later, she lowered her head and said in a trembling voice, "Sister went into the palace yesterday to tend to the Emperor's wounds. She still hasn't come back." "That's normal." Fan Xian had long heard this news from Yin Bingyun's mouth. Calmly, he said, "The Emperor has always grabbed people's weak spots tightly. Only the old cripple didn't have any weak spots for him to grab. That's why he ended up like this today." Speaking of Chun Pingping, Fan Xian's face darkened. In reality, Chun Pingping's only weak spot in this life was Fan Xian. However, this old cripple still separated Fan Xian in such a hopeless situation, leaving the Emperor unable to grab hold of him. In the end, they could only walk into a deadlock. After saying this, Fan Xian fell asleep. With his feet in the basin and his head lowered to his chest, he fell into a deep sleep. Having not slept for a long time, he finally relaxed his state of mind in front of his wife. With a glimmer of unshakable sorrow on his face, he fell into a deep sleep. Lin Wonder gently stopped the movements of her hands and looked at the haggard and sorrowful face. For some reason, sorrow welled up in her heart, and a few tears rolled down. She gazed at Fan Xian and thought, when did that bright and beautiful youth become so pitiful? Fan Xian slept for a full day and night. When he slowly woke up, he found that it was already dusk. The slightly dim light of dusk seeped in through the window and covered everything familiar in the room with a layer of unfamiliar light. Wan Er's voice came faintly from outside the window. It seemed that she was ordering the servants to do something. Fan Xian didn't want to startle her, so he continued to lie quietly in the warm, thin blankets. He didn't want to get up. Perhaps he knew that once he came out of the soft blankets, he would have to face what had already happened and what was about to happen. His gaze turned slightly and saw a towel by the bed. Extending his hand, he pulled it over and gently wiped the dirt at the corner of his eyes. Immediately after, he looked at his body and found that it was clean and fresh. It looked like Wan Er had wiped his body while he was sleeping. Just these two simple movements caused his entire body to ache with unbearable pain. The 1,000 miles of rushing, the valiant fighting, and the pain that seeped deep into his bones had indeed caused him to weaken to the extreme. It was absolutely not something that could be recovered with a simple sleep. Fan Xian lay quietly on the bed and slowly activated the 2 powers of Jinqi in his body, particularly Tianyi Dao's natural method, to recover his yuanqi. His gaze stared straight at the ceiling embroidered with complicated patterns and thought to himself, what is the man in the palace thinking at this time? Chapter 707. The vast expanse of white was very clean. The world was covered in melted snow. No one knew how deep it was. The snowy plains stretched straight to the horizon. No one knew how wide it was. At the other end of the horizon, a tall snowy peak abruptly rose, piercing straight into the clouds like a treasured sword thrust into the sky. This snowy mountain was very tall. It made one sigh in admiration and fear, not daring to get close. Fan Xian lowered his head and found that his bare feet were stepping in the snow. Strangely, he did not feel any icy pain. He could only clearly feel the touch of each snowflake. He felt strange. Narrowing his eyes, he looked toward the tall mountain in front of the snowy plains. His eyes were pierced by the light reflected off the ice and snow on the mountain walls. The world was very bright. It was like there were 9 suns above the snowy clouds. Fan Xian didn't know how long he had walked in this snowy plain. 5 days? 6 days? He had not slept, but the sky had not darkened. It was as if there was no difference between day and night in this ghastly place. The last time I came, it was always night. Later, the heavens opened their eyes, and it became day. A voice rang out beside Fan Xian's ear. He turned his head to look and saw a face he hadn't seen in a long time. The old face carried an unhealthy flush. It was obvious that it was a side effect of taking ephedra pills. Fan Xian tilted his head and looked strangely at Xiao In, thinking, didn't you die? How could you appear in front of me and speak so clearly? He felt it was strange, but there was a kind of unconsciously mental strength that stopped him from thinking about this strange question. Instead, he asked straightforwardly, the temple is in that snowy mountain. Yes, that is the holy land of the human world, a place mortals cannot touch. Xiao In sighed. Then, his face became countless specks of light and fragments that landed on the snowy ground and could not be found again. Fan Xian crouched down and used his red hands to dig around in the snow. It was as if he wanted to grab the already dead Xiao In back and continue to ask questions. After digging for a while, the snow pit grew deeper and deeper, but he couldn't find a trace. Instead, beside the gradually deepening snow pit, he saw a shadow. A hemp-clothed man wearing a straw hat was sitting beside the snow pit. His eyes were as clear as the ocean as he quietly watched the snowy mountain. Where did your shoes go? Where are my shoes? Fan Xian jumped out of the snow pit and glanced at his bare and red feet. He then glanced at the similarly bare feet of the hemp-clothed man wearing the straw hat. His gaze passed through the straw hat and saw the man's bald head. With a smile, he said, "I know you are Ku-he. Back then, you also came to the temple. You and Xiao have both eaten human flesh." Sitting on the snowy ground, Ku-he smiled and said, "The temple is not holy. It is just an abandoned temple. But everyone in the world knows that you have boundless respect for the temple. You once knelt on the bluestone steps in front of the temple for several months before you received the ultimate skill. But you know that's not the case." Ku-he turned his head and looked calmly at Fan Xian. What power in this world is undefeatable? After saying this, Ku-he disappeared. It was as if he had never appeared. In a flash, in the place where Ku-he had disappeared, the short sword Saint Great Grandmaster suddenly appeared. With a pair of wide eyes, he roared angrily at Fan Xian. "Where are my ashes? Where are my ashes?" Fan Xian jumped in fright. Only now did he remember that he seemed to have forgotten something. He seemed to have promised Sigu Jian that if he went to the temple, he would bring his ashes and scatter them on the stone steps of the temple, so that he could see what kind of extraordinary figure was in the temple. Fan Xian was vexed and said, "That mountain is so tall and cold. I can't even get close. Even if I brought your ashes, it would be useless. This is an excuse." Sigu Jian roared angrily. "It is just an excuse." Then, Sigu Jian's sword came thrusting forward. It swept up a snowflake that spread between heaven and earth. It was graceful, beautiful, and irresistible. Fan Xian's face paled. Using all the strength in his body, his bare feet desperately stepped on the soft, snowy plains as he charged toward the snowy mountain in front of him that was so tall it seemed impossible to conquer. Then he saw a black dot slowly and steadily heading up the snowy mountain. Fan Xian was overjoyed. In a loud voice, he called out, "Uncle Wu Zhu, wait for me." It was like the black-clothed Wu Zhu did not hear any sound. He continued to coldly and firmly walk up the mountain. However, the sword behind Fan Xian had already arrived. There was only one sword flower. In an instant, it bloomed into countless petals. Each petal sliced off a piece of flesh from Fan Xian's chest. The boundless and endless pain made Fan Xian cry out wretchedly. He fell to the ground. The blood from his body flowed onto the snowy ground and was immediately frozen into a deep red flower of blood. It was like precious and murderous agate. Fan Xian watched as Uncle Wu Zhu walked toward the snowy mountain. The snowy mountain was still tall and cold. He felt the unbearable pain from his heart and the despair and fear that filled his mind. Then he woke up. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt and struggled to sit up in bed. His body was covered in sweat and had soaked all of his undergarments. He unconsciously touched his chest and found that other than a little sore, there were no real pieces of flesh that had been sliced off. It was already night. It looked like after he had woken up at dusk, he had looked calmly at the top of the bed and then fallen asleep again. He didn't know why he had such a nightmare. The top figures who had once spread their elegance under heaven appeared one by one in his dreams and told him the story of the snowy mountain. They then persuaded him, encouraged him, and abandoned him. Fan Xian panted heavily and wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. He stared in a daze at the blanket on his body and thought of the snowy mountain in his dream. He still shivered despite not being cold. He knew what the snowy mountain in his dream represented in the real world. He also knew that man was actually more powerful and colder than the snowy mountain. However, with the snowy mountain in front of him, he had to climb it. In the royal study in the royal palace, the emperor slowly opened his eyes and woke up. He looked at the lights on the table around him. Only then did he know that it was already night. His gaze was cold and strange because he had a dream earlier. He dreamed that he was standing on a lonely snowy mountain, enjoying the worship and reverence of countless commoners on the snowy plains below. However, there was no one by his side. He was as lonely as the snowy mountain. Those commoners were about to be frozen into zombies. Perhaps there was not much joy to be taken from being worshipped by such creatures. The emperor slowly closed his eyes and thought of the eyes that had coldly watched him in his dream, the eyes of those familiar companions. He didn't speak for a long time. "I want to burn my face," the emperor said. Eunuch Yao, who had been waiting at the side the entire time, bowed and accepted the order. He pushed open the door to the royal study. Before he left, he quietly reported, "Sir Yizhong has been waiting in the front hall." The emperor didn't say anything. He waved his hand in annoyance, and the door to the royal study was closed. Although the Qing emperor had his own palace in the back of the palace, he had been diligent in state affairs for many years. Additionally, he had extraordinary energy and was used to staying up late in the royal study to examine memorials. There were all kinds of bedding set up here, so he rarely returned to the palace to rest. Instead, he often spent the night in the royal study. It would not be a lie to say that most of the Qing emperor's life was spent in the royal study. Usually, after nightfall, other than the emperor, only his most trusted eunuchs could enter this quiet study. After Eunuch Hong died and Hong Zhu lost power, the only person who could stay in the royal study at night was Eunuch Yao. However, there was another woman in the quiet study today. There was a natural sense of calmness between the lady's brows. Her face was delicate and pretty. She wore a thin half-fur shirt and sat quietly on the round stool opposite the soft mattress. There was a box by her feet. The emperor glanced at the woman and warmly said, "You haven't rested much these 2 days. In a moment, go to the back of the palace to rest." Fan Rou bowed calmly and didn't say anything. Ever since she had been brought into the palace at noon the day before yesterday to tend to the emperor's wounds, her movements had been greatly restricted. Although no one had said anything explicitly, she knew she had to stay in the palace. During these 2 days, the emperor had kept her by his side. Even when he was in the royal study looking at matters, and when his subordinates reported on information related to the Fan Manor, Fan Rou was always at the side, listening quietly. The emperor did not seem to avoid her. The emperor glanced at her lightly and easily saw a glimmer of deep worry in the calmness between her brows. He knew what she was worried about. Strangely, the emperor had kept the young lady of the Fan family by his side, not just to suppress Fan Xian, or because Fan Rou wanted to tend to his wounds. Rather, the emperor felt that this niece's refreshing and indifferent nature suited his temperament. Furthermore, when he casually chatted with her, regardless of whether it was about astronomy, geography, or the various sights of the world, Fan Rou was always able to say a word or two to the emperor. "Don't worry about anything." The emperor coughed gently. Although Fan Rou had miraculous hands and had already taken out most of the metal shards and steel balls in his body, the destructive power of Chun Pingping's wheelchair had been too great. No one knew that his injuries were actually very serious. The Qing emperor was a great grandmaster, so he was able to survive. If it had been anyone else, they would probably have long died under Chun Pingping's twin spears. "Enji, your brother has some misunderstandings toward me. Once these misunderstandings are cleared up in the future, everything will be fine." For some reason, the emperor didn't seem to want to see the young lady of the Fan family worry and went against his nature to explain this in a quiet voice. These were indeed the emperor's sincere words. In his opinion, Enji had always been a person who valued friendship. Chun Pingping's tragic death would inevitably make it difficult for him to understand and come around for a moment. In the future, if Fan Xian knew of the great evil Chun Pingping had done to the Li royal family and how he had attacked Fan Xian so many times, Fan Xian would understand. "You are right, Your Majesty." Fan Rou lowered her head and agreed. The emperor's expression became somewhat dark. He didn't like the way the young lady of the Fan family spoke. After a long time, he didn't explode. He only slowly closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Enji has already slept for a day and night. It looks like he has had a hard journey." Fan Rou raised her head and gently bit her lower lip. Looking at the emperor in front of her, whom she could not see through no matter what, she didn't know how to respond. Her brother was currently sleeping on the bed in the manor. Presumably, he would not be sleeping well. What kind of emotion did the emperor's words represent? "Tell me about when you first learned martial arts in Qing Mountain. I have never stepped foot into northern Qi territory. This has always been my regret." The emperor naturally changed the topic. For some reason, he really did go along with Fan Ruo's wishes. He knew that if they talked about Jingdo and the Fan Manor, it would chill the young lady's heart. Of course, before long, I will be able to go to Qing Mountain and see for myself. The emperor smiled slightly. Fan Ro respectfully replied, "The scenery on Qing Mountain is very good. The brothers of Tianyi Dao are also very good to me. You are, after all, a citizen of the Qing kingdom. Although I don't know what trick Fan Xian used to force Ku He, that bald man, to take you as his last disciple, presumably those northern Qi people still don't feel comfortable looking at you," the emperor carelessly said as he rubbed the white hair at his temples. Fan Ro smiled naturally and said, "Your Majesty's eyes are like torches." At the time, the situation was indeed like that. However, later on, the teacher spoke. Additionally, Sister Haidang returned to the mountain. Naturally, things got better. Speaking of Haidang, how exactly was Ji and her dealt with? A glimmer of emotion flashed through the emperor's eyes as he calmly asked. Fan Ruo could clearly sense that the emperor was not using this matter to ask about anything. Rather, he was curious about the story of a man and a woman that was being spread around by the people of the world. She looked in a daze at the emperor's slightly pale face. Suddenly, she thought that these things all had to do with her brother. Her brother would never discuss the details of these things with the emperor. Was this a conversation about family matters? Fan Ruo suddenly understood. The emperor was just old, just lonely, just lonely. It was just that as a father, he had never received the treatment of a father. So he had her stay in the palace to talk to her more. He wanted to know more about the ordinary things in the world, and he wanted to know more about things related to her brother. The emperor and his young daughter's family conversation continued calmly and strangely. It was clear that the emperor's mood had improved. A rare warm expression began to appear on his pale face. The door to the royal study opened. Eunuch Yao led 2 young eunuchs in carrying a copper basin. Inside the basin was steaming hot water. The emperor accepted the hot towel from Eunuch Yao's hands and used his gaze to indicate for Fan Ruo to continue talking. He then placed the rolling towel on his face and forcefully wiped his eyes a few times. Under the towel, the Qing emperor slowly closed his eyes. No one could see his expression. No one knew that in that moment he had suddenly thought of how he had taken Li Chongping back to the palace after the autumn rain. Little San Er's hand, which he had held, had been trembling the entire time. His gaze as he looked at him was filled with fear. It was very much like Changqian many years ago. A cold anger suddenly surged in the emperor's heart. He tore off the towel from his face and threw it to the ground. After taking a few deep breaths, he suppressed his temper and looked at Eunuch Yao. "What took so long?" Eunuch Yao knelt down and replied in a trembling voice. "The internal court had something important to report earlier, so I was delayed." "Speak." "The spies the internal court placed outside the Fan Manor." Speaking of this, Eunuch Yao glanced unconsciously at the young lady of the Fan Manor, who was staring at him in a daze. He then quickly lowered his head. A total of 14 people. They were all killed. The emperor's face suddenly became as heavy as ice. He slowly sat up straight on the bed and looked at Eunuch Yao without saying a word. Fan Ruo, who was sitting to the side, suddenly heard this news. Her face gradually paled. She could not get over it. These 2 days, she had been guarding the royal study by the emperor's side. She knew that her brother had returned to the capital and the manor. Although the internal court and military had, on the surface, relaxed their suppression of the Fan Manor, they still left countless spies outside the manor responsible for monitoring. Those spies were all dead? What was her brother thinking? Did he not know that the emperor had him sleep peacefully in the manor, waiting for him to wake up and enter the palace to ask for punishment? Yet he insisted on killing all of the people the emperor had sent out. Was he not afraid of angering the emperor? The frost on the emperor's face slowly melted. The corners of his lips twitched slightly. He smiled with a glimmer of mockery. Calmly, he said, "Continue to send people over. I have millions of people under heaven. Can he kill them all by himself?" The front doors of the Fan Manor were wide open. Lanterns hung high, illuminating half the street in the south of the city as clearly as if it was daytime. The Duke of Donbois was covered in blood. He walked out from the shadows that the lanterns could not reach. Under the terrified gazes of the people on the street, wearing official robes and revealing their identities, he slowly walked to the front door of his home. He sat down on a long bench in front of the Fan Manor's front door and threw the blood-stained sword of the Wei Emperor at his feet. He extended his hand and rubbed it a few times in the basin of hot water a servant brought over. The clear water in the basin immediately turned into blood. Chapter 708. Fan Xian washed his hands seriously. He changed 3 basins of clear water before he was able to wash the blood off his hands. The servants pulled out the blood into the mud beside the stone lions in front of the Fan Manor's front door. No one knew if it would raise some vicious, resentful spirit. The clothes on his body were still covered in blood. He took them off without a care and changed into a fresh outer garment. The sleeves of his clothes fluttered slightly in the early autumn night wind. All of this dramatic scene was completed in front of the Fan Manor's front door. The Jingdo magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, who had heard the news and rushed over, the head of the Ministry of Justice, and the internal court eunuchs who had rushed over from the palace all saw everything clearly. Fan Xian's hands, which were exposed outside his sleeves, were still trembling slightly. After all, he had used up too much energy for 6 or 7 days. It was not something that could be recovered with a single sleep. Additionally, under the cover of the night earlier, he had held the sword in his hand and reaped the lives of the people responsible for watching outside the manor like a demon. It was another great loss. It made his face slightly pale. His handsome and slightly pale face, paired with the sword on the ground and the stench of blood all around him, made Fan Xian appear particularly terrifying. He was the current director of the Overwatch Council. He was a killing god in the dark that the Overwatch Council had used 20 years to cultivate. However, people were always blinded by his identity, his title, his power, and his glory. No one would have thought that Fan Xian's most powerful aspect was his ability to kill. Of course, he had not killed all of the spies the palace had sent to watch the Fan Manor. Those who were able to escape before Fan Xian attacked or reveal their identities were only knocked to the ground by him. As for the spies who were particularly close to the Fan Manor, within the confines of an alley, and disguised as various commoners and merchants, they did not have any chance to negotiate or show weakness. They became a wisp of spirit on the edge of the sword in his hand. Waking from that nightmare, Fan Xian's eyes left the cold stimulation of the snowy mountain. The first thing he did was launch a counterattack. However, this counterattack was unavoidably overly bloody and unreasonable. Fan Xian was not a bloodthirsty person. He knew that the spies outside the Fan Manor were all people the Emperor and important officials in court had sent. These people did not understand Fan Xian's current state of mind, so he had to be on guard. However, he had to kill. After opening his eyes, his first accurate judgment was that the Emperor would certainly reduce his power and strictly control his connections with the Overwatch Council subordinates loyal to him. Although Yin Bingyun, with the help of the royal palace and the suppression of military power, controlled that square and sinister building in name, everyone knew that after Chun Pingping's tragic death in front of the royal palace, this sinister courtyard only had one master left, Fan Xian. As long as Fan Xian was able to re-establish countless ties with the Overwatch Council, then even the Emperor would not be able to stop Fan Xian from successfully gathering the power of the Overwatch Council. At least in the short term, the Emperor would not allow Fan Xian to have the Overwatch Council's help again. Yi Zhong had led troops to invite Fan Xian back to the capital and had planted so many spies outside the manor. It was clear that the Emperor wanted to temporarily put Fan Xian under house arrest in the manor. Fan Xian could not give the Emperor time to gradually make arrangements. Once Fan Xian lost contact with the Overwatch Council for too long, the court would gradually break down the internal composition of the Overwatch Council and invite out the officials loyal to Chun Pingping and Fan Xian one by one. Then they would desperately mix in sand, just like how the Imperial Censorate had mixed sand into the Overwatch Council 2 years ago. Before the Overwatch Council left his control, Fan Xian had to take the initiative layer by layer and prepare to have the power that belonged to him return to the darkness and calm, waiting for the time he needed them again. All of this was based on Fan Xian having to contact them, the most loyal Qinian unit. The spies outside the Fan Manor had to die. Fan Xian would not take the risk of carrying out such a dangerous task while someone was following him. Under the suppression of the Emperor's authority, the only way to make the surveillance outside the Fan Manor show a gap was the terror of blood and death. Other than this, there was no other way. Earlier, when a crow from the First Bureau had risked his life to deliver the news into the Fan Manor, it made Fan Xian's heart freeze and his hand that held the sword. 4 Overwatch Council officials had already been hanged in the prison. They were not the heads of the 8 bureaus. It looked like Yin Bingyun was still desperately trying to preserve the Overwatch Council's power. However, he was still unable to protect those 2 officials. Those 4 officials were the ones who had tried to forcefully take action and save the old director when Chun Pingping had been sent to the Overwatch Council's prison. The Emperor would certainly not allow officials who dared to go against his will to exist, so they died cleanly. For Fan Xian, this was a dangerous signal. It was a dangerous signal that the Emperor was beginning to purge the Overwatch Council. Thus, he also took action. He did not use any insignificant power or any subordinates he could use. He only personally stepped over the high threshold of the Fan Manor. Pulling out the cold longsword behind him, he walked through the night and killed 14 people. Lanterns hung high in front of the Fan Manor door. Torches gathered in the long streets in the south of the city, illuminating it as if it were daytime. A few officials looked at the bloody bodies being carried out from the streets. They looked at each other and felt a chill in their hearts. Their faces were deathly pale. They didn't know what to say. They had always known that Sir Fan Jr. was a powerful figure who did not act according to common sense. However, they still did not understand why Sir Fan Jr. would risk the Emperor's anger and the danger of being captured and imprisoned to kill so many people in front of so many people. The officials all knew that the corpses piled up in the carriages were all capable spies sent by the palace and their own yamens. Their target was the little Duke of Fan Manor. No wonder he was so angry. Was the follow-up to his anger such a brutal killing? From the internal court to the Overwatch Council to the Ministry of Justice, all of the departments and yamens in the Qin court were probably used to sending out spies to find out the information they needed. The first 2 terrifying existences were even more so. No one knew how many spies they had planted in the manors of the various nobles and officials in Jingdou. The Overwatch Council was an old hand at doing this. It was rumored that the First Bureau had already reached the level of planting spies in the manors of every official in the capital above the 6th level. The matter of spies was not a secret in the officialdom of Jingdou. The officials were all used to this. Even if one day, due to some strange matter, they discovered that there were spies from the palace or the Overwatch Council in their manors, they could only foolishly pretend they didn't know. If they couldn't pretend anymore, they could only treat them well. Then, they would verbally remind them and politely escort them out of the manors and back to their yamens. The officials knew that these spies represented the Emperor's eyes and the might of the court. They had never thought that an official would be like Sir Fan Jr. and coldly and arrogantly kill all of these spies. The Deputy Assistant Minister of the Ministry of Justice glanced at the embarrassed Sun Jingxiu and said in a low voice, "Sir Sun, you have to ask the little Duke what happened today." Killing people on the street was already a violation of the death penalty in the Qing law. Even though Fan Xian was of high status and had entered the range of the 8 deliberations and could be exempted from the death penalty, it was still difficult to forgive him. Furthermore, the people he had killed were all secretly officials of the court. However, Fan Xian washed his blood-stained hands in the firelight and changed into blood-stained clothes in front of all the officials. His expression was cold and calm. Who dared to go forward and capture him? Among the officials, only the Jingdou magistrate, Sun Jingxiu, was in charge of this matter. Everyone knew that the Sun Manor had a close relationship with the Little Duke. A few months ago, the Little Duke had fought with Scholar He of the Hall of Governmental Affairs for the sake of Sun Jingxiu's future. He had fought until Scholar He's face was covered in dirt. Thus, the gazes of all the officials landed on Sun Jingxiu's face. Sun Jingxiu's heart was bitter. He knew what his colleagues were afraid of. However, these days were even more difficult for him. First, something major had happened to the Overwatch Council. In the end, Director Chun had been tragically killed by 1,000 cuts. That day, he had personally seen Sir Fan Jr. ride alone into the execution field. He had been so scared that his entire body had gone cold. He didn't know what kind of role Sir Fan Jr. would play in the court in the future. Would he sink into oblivion, or would he be severely punished by the Emperor? If Fan Xian fell and lost power, Sun Jingxiu would not have a good end. Thus, he had been waiting in the Jingdo government in terror for the Emperor's edict to remove his position. Unexpectedly, before the Emperor's edict had arrived, his backer, Sir Fan Jr., had done such a shocking and treasonous thing. He walked with his body bent to the front door of the Fan Manor and bowed deeply to Fan Xian. He then quietly asked a few questions. Fan Xian was sitting tiredly on the long bench. The sword of the Wei Emperor had been thrown at his feet. Seeing Sun Jingxiu come forward, he was not surprised. With a cold expression, he replied. The officials were afraid and did not go forward. They didn't know what exactly the two of them were talking about, so they could only wait patiently. After Sun Jingxiu walked down the stone steps, the assistant minister of the Ministry of Justice furrowed his brows and said, "What did the Duke say? This is not a small matter. Killing someone on the street, even if it is made to Taichung Temple, there has to be an explanation." The assistant minister did not have the boldness to have the 13 yamens of the Ministry of Justice send people into the Fan Manor to capture people. However, the Qing laws were strict. Seeing this scene, these officials could not pretend they didn't see anything. No one knew what Fan Xian had said to Sun Jingxiu earlier, but the Jingdo magistrate no longer had much fear on his face. With a calm expression, he said, "The Duke said that Jingdo has not been peaceful recently. The Overwatch Council has found that some old women have come into the capital to kidnap children. As you know, there are 2 young masters in the Fan Manor, so Sir Fan Jr. is nervous." Earlier, after eating, he walked around the various streets and alleys outside the manor and saw some eye-catching people. At a glance, he knew they were not decent people, so he asked a few questions. Unexpectedly, those people were so daring to take out a weapon and attack the Duke. Of course, the Duke would not be polite to these scoundrels. After these words came out, the officials in the center sucked in a cold breath. They had seen shameless and ruthless nobles, but they had never seen such a shameless and ruthless noble. 14 lives had been taken just like that. He had also forcefully framed the other party as a suspect of the old woman. This was self-defense and seemed to make sense. However, to say that the little Duke of the Fan Manor had single-handedly gone to ask for the whereabouts of the old woman and ended up being hunted down by 14 people, no one would believe it no matter how they tried to explain it. Naturally, I do not believe it, but I also do not have any evidence. Of course, I can ask the Duke to return to the Yamen for questioning and to record an offering or something. However, it is already late at night. I'm not interested. Sun Jingxiu's back suddenly straightened. Gazing at his colleagues beside him, he coldly said, "Sir, the Yamen also has this kind of authority. If you're willing to take over this case, you can do as you please. However, I would like to remind everyone that the people who died were mostly people from the palace. The palace has not spoken, so it is best not to act rashly." This was a huge sentence of nonsense. Everyone knew who had died outside the Fan Manor. This was originally a matter between the Emperor and the Duke. Even if these officials were given a few guts, they would not dare to interfere. However, Fan Xian had gone too far. The matter was about to reach the palace. If these officials did not react first, who knew what the palace would think of them? After Sun Jingxiu said this, he left with the bailiffs of the Jingdo government. He could no longer be bothered with these matters. The simple conversation with Fan Xian earlier had put him at ease. Although the taste of the meatball was not very good, at least the Duke had said that as long as he did not die, the Sun Manor would be fine. Having said this much, Sun Jingxiu had nothing else to complain about. Everything was up to fate. Watching the people of the Jingdo government leave through the front door of the Fan Manor, Fan Xian rose from the long bench and glanced coldly at the officials below the stone steps. Picking up the Sword of the Wei Emperor, which everyone viewed as a treasure, from beside his feet, like picking up a mop with water on it, he casually slapped it a few times on the stone lion's head. This action was very much like a shameless and reckless brat. Yet, it was done by Sir Fan Jr. The strong contrast made the expressions of the officials change. Entering the manor, a serving girl had long since come forward to hand him a thick robe. Only then did Fan Xian feel his body warm a little. As he tightened his robe, he walked toward the back of the manor and casually asked, "Is the water for the reed roots ready? If it's ready, then quickly send it over." The serving girl made a sound of acknowledgement and went to the kitchen to keep an eye on it. Fan Xian walked alone to the back of the manor and sat by the bed. Facing his wife, Lin Wan-er, who was sitting at the table, he quietly said, "I killed 14. Tomorrow, perhaps 28 will come. Actually, those are just subordinates of the court. They receive orders from the palace and various departments. Why bother?" A glimmer of pity appeared on Lin Wan-er's face. "Besides, even if you are unhappy and want to avenge the 2 Overwatch Council subordinates who died in prison, there is no need to vent your anger on those people. You don't understand. The Emperor wants to keep me under house arrest in this manner. He knows that unless he personally leaves the palace to keep an eye on me, even if Yizhong comes, it would be impossible to cut off my contact with the outside world." Fan Xian wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead. He felt that his body was still weak. In a raspy voice, he said, "The Emperor has to attend to many affairs every day. How could he personally keep an eye on me? Thus, he can only cast a large net outside our manor. I have to rip apart this net. Otherwise, I will become a frog in a pot of warm water. When I die, I won't even know how I died." A chilling coldness rose between Fan Xian's brows. "But you also said that you killed 14 people today. Tomorrow, there could be 28. The Emperor is the master of Qin Kingdom. All the officials and people under heaven are tools in his hands. No matter what, it is impossible to kill them all." Lin Wan-er looked at him with a worried expression. "Killing too many will naturally cause people to be afraid," Fan Xian said with his head slightly lowered. "Although imperial power is deeply rooted in the hearts of the people and cannot be resisted, the fear of death will presumably cause the spies and officials pulling the net to unconsciously reveal some openings." Hearing these words, the worry on Lin Wan-er's face did not fade. Her watery eyes were filled with concern and unease toward Fan Xian. In a quiet voice, she said, "If the Emperor wants to subdue you, there are many other ways." Fan Xian's hands rested on either side of his body. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then faintly said, "By keeping my sister in the palace, he is forcing me to not leave the capital. If he wants to subdue me, he must lock me up in the royal palace by his side. I don't think the Emperor will take this risk." Speaking of this, he raised his head and looked at his wife's worried face. Warmly, he said, "Shunning and Liangzi have already left the city. You've done very well in this matter. Otherwise, as parents, we would not be able to do as we please in the capital." Cece and the others should have already reached the manor, but I think there will certainly be news from the palace. Lin Wan-er sighed and walked to his side. Gently, she leaned her head on his shoulder. "I don't care what you want to do. You have to think my sister is still in the palace, and the 2 little ones haven't gone far. That's why I need to get in touch with my people." Fan Xian tenderly and gently stroked his wife's slightly thin face. Cece is usually unremarkable, but she is actually a very assertive person who can endure hardship. Tung Zijing is experienced in handling matters. Presumably, he won't let the palace catch the tail. If I can get in touch with the people in the Qinian unit, I will have a way to send them back to Danzhou. As for my sister still in the palace, she should be fine. Fan Xian's voice suddenly became cold. "I am directly challenging the Emperor's authority because I want to see just how far he wants to go. Are you really not afraid that Uncle the Emperor will punish you severely?" Lin Wan sat up straight and looked at him worriedly. She knew very well how cold-blooded and heartless the relative sitting on the throne was. Once he discovered that Fan Xian was no longer the illegitimate child he could control, what kind of response would he make? Lin Wanner always thought that Fan Xian's present actions appeared overly aggressive and risky. Any of the emperor's actions have nothing to do with family or feelings. They only have to do with profit, Fan Xian said with his eyes closed. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, "If we acknowledge this benchmark, we could try to analyze it. Perhaps the emperor will be angry, but he will not force me into a desperate situation. Regardless of whether it is the children I plan to send to Danzhou, in the palace, or you." Fan Xian opened his eyes and looked at his wife. Slowly, he said, "These are all my bottom lines. If the emperor breaks this bottom line, then he can only force us to completely turn against him early." Lin Wanner looked at him with some confusion. Fan Xian said, "I never underestimate any of my enemies, but I also never underestimate myself. Regardless of whether the emperor forces me to rebel or kills me, it will only bring him, the Qin court, consequences that he will find difficult to bear and a chaotic situation that will be difficult to clean up. If I die, what will happen to Dongyi? Will Sigu Jian's disciples and grand disciples still abide by that unwritten agreement? Although the court has mixed in the 10,000 elite soldiers in the Great Prince's hands, the movements of the Imperial Army 3 years ago have already shown our brother's ability to control troops. He can completely control this powerful army in a short amount of time. If Chen Pingping dies, and I die as well, brother will certainly not listen to me. Even if he doesn't lead the army back to Jingdou, he will at least stay in Dongyi and watch coldly over father in Jingdou. It would be best if the emperor doesn't use Aunt Ning to threaten him. From your description, after the incident in the royal study, Aunt Ning already has the will to die. Given her valiant and hot-blooded personality, if the emperor uses her life to threaten brother to return to the capital, she will probably immediately die in front of the emperor. Yin Zhilan is also not an idiot. If I die, he will certainly be able to guess my brother's thoughts. With such a powerful ally for no reason, he will certainly do his best to assist and maintain Dongyi's independent position. If I die, what kind of reaction will Hongsheng, who is still in Dingzhou, have? If I die, what kind of upheaval will happen to Jiangnan that I have managed for 5 years? Even if Xia Qifei betrays me, I still have enough ways to throw all of Jiangnan into chaos. Not to mention the Overwatch Council. Presently, the Overwatch Council is maintaining its silence. One reason is the army outside the council. The more important reason is that all of the officials are watching me in secret. They want to know what I want to do. If I also die, the Overwatch Council will fall apart. Look, if the emperor truly forces me to rebel or directly kills me on the spot, it will bring so much upheaval. A strange smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Faintly, he said, "How could he bear to? How could he dare?" In reality, Fan Xian still had a lot of bargaining chips hidden behind his back that he had not spoken of. There was no need. Secondly, he himself did not have much confidence in the bargaining chips in the north. However, up to this point, the last 4 words he coldly spoke were just that resolute and full of confidence. Inheriting his mother's legacy, the care of countless elders, the emperor's favor and trust over these years, and the support of those strange old creatures, whether openly or secretly, Fan Xian finally lived up to everyone's expectations and became the only major figure in this world who could face the powerful emperor of the Qin kingdom and not have to retreat. Perhaps no one noticed this usually. Once people focused their gazes here, they would be shocked to discover that the storms in the Qin kingdom and the world these years had created such an abnormal existence as Fan Xian. "I think you still underestimate the emperor," Lin Wanner said quietly after a long silence. Lin Wanner was silent for a long time. She then quietly said, "Perhaps for the sake of the Qin kingdom, for the sake of the world, he will tolerate your great disrespect. But this is not just because he is afraid of the things you can influence. It includes many other things, perhaps some subtle things. Once he discovers that you truly do not have any affection for him, he will directly erase you." The best way to destroy a person is to destroy his physical body. Lin Wanner looked at Fan Xian in a daze. "Do you think that if the emperor could bear to kill you, he would care about Dongyi returning and rebelling?" Would he care about Li Hongqing's little power in Dingzhou? Would he care about how much hunger and pain the people of Jiangnan will suffer? If he could bear to kill you, how could he care about anything else in the world? Even if the entire world has turned its back on the emperor, he still has the courage and power to fight his way out. Furthermore, you can, at most, add a few hard-to-repair scars to his world. Lin Wanner gently stroked his haggard and pale face and sighed. Don't think for me, don't think for the child. No matter what you do, think more about yourself. Fan Xian was silent. He had to admit that although he had the deepest understanding of the emperor in this world, his wife, who had grown up at the emperor's knee, had a better grasp of emotions, thoughts, and habits. Let's not talk about this. When the reed root soup arrives, you have to drink it while it's hot. Fan Xian forced a smile. These years, Wanner's illness had been very stable. Other than Sir Fei and Fan Xian's medicine, the biggest contributor was the soup made from the reed roots of the North Sea. As the words left his mouth, Fan Xian suddenly thought of the North Sea. He thought of the reed leaves that pricked a person's skin. He thought of the woman he hadn't seen in a long time and hadn't thought of in a long time. He wondered if she was doing well and she who. The reason he suddenly thought of Haidang Duo was because after the conversation earlier, Fan Xian had more clearly determined what he should do. Wana was right. The best way to destroy a person was to destroy his physical body. Fan Xian closed his eyes in silence, thinking about how to melt the snowy mountain that had not melted in 10,000 years. How could he defeat a great grandmaster? Haitang? Or 13th Wang? Or himself? Or is it that no one in this world could do it? Fan Xian began to miss Uncle Wu Zhu, but it was not because he missed the metal drill by his side. Rather, it was because when his state of mind darkened, he unconsciously missed his closest family. The next day, the front doors of the Fan Manor opened wide. The spies sent by the internal court once again filled the dark corners of this street in the south of the city. It looked like the emperor in the palace knew what his illegitimate son was thinking and testing. He only sat calmly in the royal study and met the myriad changes by remaining unchanging. He wasted away Fan Xian's time and gradually raised the temperature of the water in the pot. The large piece of firewood shoved under the pot was the emperor's edict that eunuch Dai had sent in the morning. Hearing the familiar Yu Yao's accent, Fan Xian knelt in the main hall in his black official robes. A calm light of everything being within his expectations flashed through his eyes. Chapter 709. The servants and serving girls in the Fan Manor heard this edict clearly. They felt a bolt of lightning strike down mercilessly and cruelly. It struck until the entire Fan Manor began to tremble and sway. The faces of the people kneeling outside the hall paled. Their hearts were shocked. They felt unease and fear for their young master. Not only them, but all of the officials and people in Jingdou knew exactly what the foundation of Sir Fan Jr.'s power was. The emperor's order to remove his position was to cut off Sir Fan Jr.'s roots. Fan Xian, who was kneeling on the ground, heard this edict. The expression on his face remained calm and did not reveal any shock or sorrow. All of this was within his expectations. Just as he had thought and deduced after tossing and turning in bed these 2 days, the emperor would try to gradually whittle away the layers of power and defense around Fan Xian's body during this time. Come to think of it, ever since he had met Wang Qinian on the road back to the capital from Dongyi, Fan Xian had done countless treasonous things in the short 10 days. The roaring shadow cavalry traversing between provinces and counties was already a great taboo. Moreover, 500 shadow cavalry had charged through more than 10 passes, which was an even greater crime in the court. Additionally, when Fan Xian charged into Jingdou, he had killed the commander of Xingyang Gate and stabbed a number of warriors on the execution field to death in front of the eyes of tens of thousands of people. Each was a crime that could not be forgiven in Qing law. Even if he was Fan Xian, he still had to pay the price for this matter. The emperor not having him imprisoned was already benevolent enough. However, such benevolence could not quell the discussion and pressure among the people in officialdom. This edict removing Fan Xian from his position as director could be considered a preliminary explanation to the world and a channel for the emperor to vent his anger. As for what other edicts the palace would send out and what attacks and losses Fan Xian would suffer, that would depend on Fan Xian's response, as well as the rumors in officialdom and among the people. Fan Xian stood somewhat woodenly and accepted the imperial edict from Eunuch Dai's hands. Very casually, he handed it to an official behind him to arrange. He did not read it carefully at all because the crimes written on the imperial edict were very real. He was not prepared to fight any lawsuits with the palace in these areas. Have a cup of tea before you leave. Fan Xian looked at Eunuch Dai warmly. It was difficult for Eunuch Dai to suppress the awkwardness and unease on his face. His rise and fall in the palace these years was actually all because of the young noble in front of him. Now, he had come to the Fan Manor to announce this edict. Eunuch Dai did not feel good in his heart. Your servant has to return to the palace. Eunuch Dai glanced at Fan Xian with an uneasy gaze. In a slightly trembling voice, he said, "The emperor is only momentarily angry. He will be fine in a few days." Fan Xian knew why he would show such an expression. He smiled and patted his shoulder. "Don't think too much. Since the emperor has allowed you to take up the important task of announcing edicts again, presumably he trusts you." Eunuch Dai bowed respectfully and was about to leave when he heard Fan Xian's low voice ring in his ear. "Is Ro doing well in the palace?" It was a great taboo for eunuchs and officials to privately pass messages. However, after Eunuch Dai thought for a moment, he did not hesitate at all. Lowering his voice, he said, "Miss Fan is doing very well. She often listens to discussions in the royal study. The emperor treats her very well. There is no need for you to worry." The entire Fan Manor was actually a true member of the Li royal family. Additionally, Fan Xian had shown Eunuch Dai kindness and authority, so the eunuch did not care about these taboos. Lowering his voice, he spoke of Fan Ro's situation in the palace these 2 days. Fan Xian raised his brows slightly in surprise. He could not guess the emperor's thoughts, nor did he understand why his sister could appear so aloof in the palace. She did not seem like a hostage at all. After the matter of welcoming the edict was finished, Fan Xian turned to the back of the main hall. Looking at his wife, who had been listening quietly in the back, he quietly said, "Today is the first wave. I have many duties on me. If the emperor wants to peel them layer by layer, it will take some time." Lin Wanner glanced at him and gently bit her lower lip. She said, "If you do not have a proper name, then your words will not be justified. Although the position of director is currently empty, and the emperor is presumably waiting for you to enter the palace to beg for forgiveness, he will still bestow this position to you in a few days. But, in the end, the emperor's power is boundless. Without the position of director, if you want to gather the power of the council in these days, there will probably be some obstacles. The emperor also knows this. That is why his first move was to remove the position in the council." Fan Xian sat down and said in a low voice, "At least for now, he still does not want the court to become chaotic, so he is slowly peeling it away and waiting for me to naturally admit my guilt and lower my head. However, after all these years, the Overwatch Council has always been under the old cripple's control. The Emperor still does not understand the workings within. Even if there are many people in the Overwatch Council who fear royal power, in the end, there are even more people who do not recognize the edict and only recognize the legacy of the council. Being under house arrest and being killed are both difficult problems to solve," Fan Xian said. "The Emperor wants the entire world, including myself, to slowly get used to the days of me losing power. That way, it will be much easier to torment me, so I have to hurry." Lin Wanner furrowed her brows. She still did not understand. Even if Fan Xian could tear apart the large net outside the manor and make contact with the members of the Chinian unit, what problem could he solve with just one meeting? "My subordinates are a group of extraordinary people." Fan Xian saw the confusion in her heart and calmly said. "Furthermore, they can help me, who is under house arrest, contact a group of even more incredible people. If Fan Xian forcefully broke through the surveillance network outside the manor, given his present cultivation, it would not be a difficult matter. Just as he said last night, unless the emperor personally came, it would be difficult to find many people in the Qing kingdom who could follow him. However, he had to consider the safety of his subordinates and his collaborators who were not in Jingdo. Thus, he could not give the palace any opportunity to follow him and clean out his true foundation. Although the position of director of the Overwatch Council had been taken away, it could not stop Fan Xian from regaining control of the Overwatch Council through the officials loyal to him and Shen Pingping. If the court truly used Fan Xian as a line to catch all the people he had hidden behind the scenes, it would be much more difficult for Fan Xian to make contact with those powers far from the court. Thus, Fan Xian's actions were very careful. His carefulness was displayed for the world to see, but it was an unreasonable and particularly bloody decision to kill. Not long after the emperor's order to remove Fan Xian from his position as director of the Overwatch Council spread throughout Jingdo, news of Sir Fan Jr. once again attacking the large network of spies outside the Fan Manor came. That day, over 20 people died outside the Fan Manor. The next day, the palace issued an edict stripping Fan Xian of his position as the head of the Palace Treasury Transport Company. It formally stripped the Palace Treasury treasure that the Qing Kingdom relied on as the foundation of its national power out of Fan Xian's control. That night, Fan Xian struck again and swept through the people in the well-shaped streets around the Fan Manor. On the third day, the palace issued an edict. Fan Xian was severely reprimanded. His position as a first-rank duke was directly taken away. 7 days later, all of the positions on the body of the Qing Kingdom's most dazzling young powerful official were mercilessly taken away. Thinking back to Jiangnan, when the dragon raised its head, the young imperial envoy who stepped off the boat had a long string of prefixes. Now, not a single one remained. From that day onwards, Fan Xian returned to being a commoner. He was even worse than the scholars who went to the capital to take the exams. He had no official position, no nominal authority, and no salary. The position in the Board of Rights that he had once held during the spring examination was also remembered by the palace. Taichung Temple's noble official position had also been taken away. The only thing Fan Xian had left was the position of a teacher in the Imperial College. It had also been demoted 3 ranks. For some reason, the emperor did not take away this position as well. During these 7 days, the royal palace and the Fan Manor were like a conveyor belt, carrying the emperor's calm and cold edicts and chilling edicts. With each edict, the light on Fan Xian's body grew a layer dimmer. The gazes of the Jingdo officials and commoners were all focused on the road in front of the Fan Manor. After that day on the execution field in the autumn rain, they all knew that this road would be very busy. However, they had not thought that it would be so busy. No one had thought that the emperor's punishment for the little duke would be so thorough and severe. No one had thought that Fan Xian would be so stiff as to resist for 7 days and still not enter the palace to beg for forgiveness. Everyone was looking at the Fan Manor, waiting to see which direction this cold war between the emperor and his illegitimate child would go. Would the emperor, in his anger, simply arrest Fan Xian and throw him into prison, or would Fan Xian be unable to resist the edicts and finally admit defeat? Even though Fan Xian was a commoner, the Jingdo people were still used to calling him Sir Fan Jr. in their leisurely conversations after meals. The officials hiding in their manors and nervously watching the development of this matter were still used to calling him Little Duke. They all knew that even though Fan Xian had been reduced to a commoner by the emperor, as long as he did not die or go into prison, he could still become a major figure at any time, second only to 1 and above tens of thousands. No one dared to underestimate Fan Xian's existence. Contrary to the expectations of many officials, Fan Xian had clearly broken countless Qing laws, disregarded the court, and killed so many people. However, in the discussions among the people, there were still not many unfavorable comments about Fan Xian. In this battle between the emperor and Fan Xian, for the first time, The Qing kingdom had a strange situation where public opinion was not completely in the palace. Perhaps it was because although Fan Xian had killed people outside the Fan Manor, he had not done it in an exaggerated manner. Other than the first and second days, his murderous aura had been greatly restrained. Furthermore, the people he had killed were all spies sent by the palace. What did it have to do with the common people? Perhaps it was because many Jingdo people had once seen Fan Xian's haggard appearance as he held Chen Pingping's body in the autumn rain. Unconsciously, they felt some sympathy for him. Human emotions had always been strange. One moment, they might be cheering. The next moment, they might begin to silently reminisce. Throughout the ages, on countless execution fields and in the face of countless deaths, such developments had occurred before. The reason why Fan Xian, a commoner, still had the support and discussion of so many people was because of his actions these years. Those glorious old things did not need to be brought up one by one to calculate their power. There was also no need to consider how much Chen Pingping had used the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council to do for Fan Xian. The reality was as such. Ever since the Emperor, who had led the Qing Iron Riders to destroy the rivers and mountains of the old dynasty and forcefully opened up countless territories, the only person in the Qing kingdom who could be called an idol was probably Fan Xian alone. If it was in Jiangnan, perhaps Fan Xian would be able to obtain even more support from the people. After all, he had operated there for the longest. Furthermore, the Hangzhou conference that Lin Wanner managed had spared no expense in comforting the people. It had long replaced the Ming family and become the most glorious name in the hearts of the poor people and scholars in Jiangnan. After all, in Jingdo, even if the people at the root of the royal palace leaned toward Fan Xian, they could not do anything. When all was said and done, this battle was, in the end, a battle between Fan Xian and the Emperor, just like the battle in the royal study. 7 days later, everything had yet to be settled. The world was not peaceful. Outside the Fan Manor, there were still gusts of autumn wind and occasional drizzle. Under Fan Xian's godlike purge, the spies sent by the internal court had no choice but to pull the large net outward. The might of imperial power was, without question, supreme. The fear of death was also supreme. Under such a pincer attack, the internal court surveillance would, without question, reveal flaws. Fan Xian stood coldly at the door of the manor and calmly looked at the movements around him. He thought of Wanner's words that day. A strange emotion flashed through his eyes. If the Emperor wanted to deal with Fan Xian's shedding of all pretenses of cordiality, he actually had many other ways. Why didn't he use them? Were the spies of the internal court moving outside because they were forced by his shrewish methods? Or had the Emperor secretly given some edict? Those spies could not be killed. Fan Xian didn't understand, and he didn't want to understand. Perhaps the man in the palace still had some warmth toward him and some hope, but he didn't want this warmth and hope to shake his heart again, the heart that had long cooled in the autumn rain. He turned and entered the Fan Manor. Not long after, a vegetable carriage also turned into a side alley beside the Fan Manor and entered a corner door. Outside the corner door, the carriage underwent the strictest inspection. Even the inner layer of each cabbage and root of each radish were not spared. The people responsible for these inspections were all officials who had revealed their identities. They were different from the internal court spies scattered around the Fan Manor. Fan Xian did not make things difficult for them. If he wanted to escape the restraints of house arrest, the ones he needed to be careful of were the spies and not these officials. There was nothing strange about the vegetable carriage. The official waved his hand and allowed the carriage to enter the Fan Manor. Not far after entering the corner door was the Fan Manor's main kitchen. Servants came forward to move the vegetables and fruits from the carriage. The edict from the palace was clear. It was impossible for anyone in the Fan Manor to leave. It was also difficult for outsiders to enter. Even though this carriage had been directly sent by the Dengshi Vegetable Inspection Bureau, it had been under the court surveillance from the very beginning. It was not afraid of what the Fan Manor or the restless Overwatch Council officials wanted to do. The driver of the carriage quietly brushed past the kitchen and walked to the back garden while no one was paying attention. Then, With the help of an old Fan Manor servant, he entered a quiet study. When the driver entered the study, he saw that other than Fan Xian, there was another woman. He immediately guessed that it was the director's wife. After a slight pause, he took off his straw hat, knelt down, and bowed. "Greetings, director." After the driver took off his straw hat, Lin Warner covered her mouth in surprise and exclaimed, "It's so alike." The driver felt slightly awkward but didn't say anything. Standing, he said straightforwardly, "The guards outside the manor have been tight these days, so no one has made any unusual movements. This is a capable member of the Chinian unit. Back in the day, he helped me greatly in northern Qi," Fan Xian explained warmly to his wife. This Overwatch Council official, who looked very much like him, had been hidden in the Chinian unit. However, even he had not thought that after being locked down for 7 days, the person from the Chinian unit who risked entering the manor to make contact with him would be this person. It's best if there are no unusual movements. Nothing is more important than one's own life, Fan Xian said warmly to his wife. This was a creed he had always endlessly instilled into the people around him, even his most loyal subordinates. Nothing was more important than one's own life. Wang Qinian did this, and so did Gao, that the net outside has loosened a bit. "I'm going out today," Fan Xian said quietly with his head slightly lowered. "Sir, this is too risky," the official said seriously. The official said seriously. He thought that since he had taken the risk to enter the manor, he could pass on the message himself. "No." Fan Xian shook his head. Those words were too important. He had to personally deliver them to each person's ears. The slightest mistake could cause great trouble. He suddenly thought that if Wang Qinian was by his side at this moment, everything would be much easier to resolve. Given Wang Qinian's abilities, sneaking into the Fan Manor under the watchful eyes of spies would probably not be a difficult matter. The vegetable delivery carriage belongs to the Produce Inspectorate. How did you get in? Fan Xian suddenly thought of this problem. His gaze narrowed slightly with some worry. Daizhan returned to the Produce Inspectorate, the official replied with a smile. Fan Xian also smiled. Eunuch Dai had once again become the head eunuch in charge of announcing edicts. Following that, his nephew also returned to his position in the Produce Inspection Bureau. Given how the Overwatch Council had dealt with the Dai family back then, it was easy to leave some loose ends. Now it was used. The autumn sky above Jingdo was clear and distant. Rain spilled down from the leaden hanging clouds, making the surrounding scenery blurry but moving. The Fan Manor and the Royal Palace had fought for 7 consecutive days, particularly Sir Fan Jr.'s merciless sweep of spies outside the manor. In the end, it had chilled the hearts of most of the spies in the internal court. They felt that their colleagues had all died for nothing. It looked like the emperor in the palace would never actually throw his illegitimate son into prison to avenge these colleagues. Thus, the net outside Fan Manor had unknowingly loosened, leaving some loopholes that could be used. The seemingly unproblematic carriage of the Produce Inspectorate had crawled out of these loopholes. In a secluded area in Jingdo, the houses and alleys were simple and crude. There were no deep gardens or large mansions of any large family. A small courtyard sat quietly at the end of one of the alleys. The sound of selling vegetables in the alleys outside could be heard clearly here. However, it had already been a number of years. No one knew what this small courtyard represented. Fan Xian wiped away the powder and rouge disguise on his face in the slight autumn rain. In a flash, he floated into the small courtyard. He saw many familiar faces. Looking at the pleasant surprise and the sadness after the pleasant surprise, Fan Xian's heart was slightly moved. However, he did not show anything on his face. This was the Chinian unit's most secret base. The Overwatch Council officials here were Fan Xian's long loyal subordinates. When the rumors in Jingdo changed, particularly when there were some subtle signs within the Overwatch Council, these members of the Chinian unit silently and quietly left their posts. Through different paths, they returned to this small courtyard and waited for Fan Xian's summons. Many years ago, when the Chinian unit only had Fan Xian and Wang Qinian, one old and one young, Wang Qinian had spent a small amount of silver to buy this courtyard. These members of the Qinian unit were like Fan Xian's eyes and arms. Fan Xian was going to mobilize the power that was close to him scattered throughout the world. He had to pass his will through these loyal eyes and arms. This was the reason why he had spent so much effort to come here personally. Chapter 710. Yesterday, I said that I had recently sunk into a state of panic. I wanted to find a day to sort it out and prepare. Today was the winter solstice, so I chose today to have a meal, recuperate, and think about the rest of the story. The reason why I wanted to pull my hair out was probably because the story had been too tormented since the beginning of the month. I laughed foolishly. At the beginning of the month, I said that the year of Qing Yu was coming to an end. It looked like the last few dozen chapters were written like crazy. I had indeed written like crazy for the past 20 days, much crazier than I had in the past year or so. Not only did I write more every day, but more importantly, I wrote impudently. I didn't know what word to use to describe this, but it was actually a kind of state. It's good to write based on one's emotions, but when one's emotions are vented and one becomes depressed, yeah, it's the same for me. I'll feel happy, angry, sad, and happy when I read the story. My brain will become like glue. In any case, this wasn't the first time. Whether it was Ingxiu roast chicken or the year of Qing Yu, as long as I was making up a story, I would always climb and fall on the same wavelength. I think everyone was like me. I didn't expect to slide on top of the waves forever and never fall. Everyone, please give me a day or two to recuperate. Let me concentrate and write properly. I want to do my best to complete this story that has accompanied us for a year and a half, and has been enduring for a year and a half, and is something that can still be read. Although this was actually just my job, I wouldn't be pretentious to say that this was a job that I liked. Moreover, I would only write stories that I liked, so I treasured and valued it. Chapter 711. There were no excessive greetings, sorrow, or anger. The members of the Qinian unit who remained in the quiet courtyard calmly greeted Fan Xian. Then, in the shortest amount of time possible, they reported the internal situation of the Overwatch Council they knew. During these 7 days, a large portion of the Bureau of Military Affairs stationed outside the Overwatch Council had been withdrawn. Under the strong pressure of the Palace Edict and Yin Bingyun's cooperation, the cleansing and changing of blood within the Overwatch Council was carried out quickly and effectively. This information was sensitive and important. However, the members of the Qinian unit in this courtyard were all capable officials in the Overwatch Council. During these 7 days, they had purposely asked around on behalf of Fan Xian, who was under house arrest in the manor. They had managed to obtain a great deal of information. Fan Xian listened silently and nodded slightly. After Chun Pingping died and his position as director was removed, the Emperor's change of blood and filling of water in the Overwatch Council was all within expectations. With Yin Bingyun's help, in addition to the Emperor's might, the Overwatch Council was like a group of dragons without a head. No one could forcefully reverse this trend. Although Yin Bingyun doesn't know about this council, he has often been at your side these years. We are somewhat worried. A member of the Qinian unit looked at Fan Xian and said, we need to choose a new meeting point in Jingdou. This official directly called Yin Bingyun by his name. It was clear he no longer had any respect. Although Yin Bingyun had never joined the Qinian unit, as Fan Xian's right-hand man and a high-ranking official of the Overwatch Council, he had always been respected by the Qinian unit. However, the things Yin Bingyun had done in the Overwatch Council these days made all of the Overwatch Council officials feel hatred toward him. Yin Bingyun was Fan Xian's trusted aide, but he was never someone Fan Xian could completely trust. This Sir Yin Jr., who was skilled in strategy, was an independent person. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then shook his head. He didn't express an opinion on this or say they should continue to choose another meeting place. He still had some hope in Yin Bingyun. He was even faintly worried that Yin Bingyun would die in the anger of the Overwatch Council. After today's meeting, the people of the Qinian unit would have to leave Jingdou. This little courtyard that Wang Qinian had spent 120 liang of silver to buy would be abandoned. There was no need to waste any more effort. Seeing Fan Xian did not reply, the official shook his head and continued his report. Once the city gates open, the people heading toward Shiliang and North Min have already left. Presumably, Sir Deng and Sir Su will receive the news at the first instant. Do not worry. This was what Fan Xian was most worried about when he was under house arrest. Deng Ziyu and Su Wenmao were his two most trusted subordinates after Wang Qinian, so he had given them the most important duties. One was in northern Qi and then Shiliang. The other was in Jiangnan, to keep an eye on the palace treasury. If these two people were eliminated by the emperor, Fan Xian would probably regret it for the rest of his life. Although he didn't know if the emperor would have the leisure to set up an assassination beforehand. Since the news had been sent out, Fan Xian felt slightly more at ease. He glanced at the members of the Qinian unit beside him in the courtyard. The corners of his lips twitched into a warm smile. He had been under house arrest in the manor for 7 days. His subordinates had also been busy for 7 days. Other than investigating information, they had finally thought of all the ways to enter the Fan Manor. It had to be said that these subordinates were the most effective group of people in the Overwatch Council. The name of the Qinian unit was taken from Wang Qinian. From the 4th year of the Qin calendar until Wang Qinian disappeared in the autumn of the 7th year of the Qin calendar, all of the members were chosen by Wang Qinian. These members were originally unremarkable civil servants outside of the Overwatch Council or lower-level officials who were not valued. However, they just happened to be in line with Fan Xian's liking and Wang Qinian's temper. Once these officials were gathered under Fan Xian's command, they suddenly recovered their initial powerful execution abilities and regained their luster. They became a secretive yet famous group within the Overwatch Council, a group that directly belonged to Fan Xian. For example, these days, the members of the Qinian unit's responses were very much in line with Fan Xian's style. Once they knew things were not going well, they would immediately retreat into the darkness. Under the precondition of protecting their own lives, they did not impulsively do anything. Instead, they carefully investigated the reactions and intelligence of all sides. They then found suitable methods to hand to Fan Xian to decide. It had to be said that it was a kind of good fortune for Fan Xian to have such loyal but not arrogant, capable but not blind subordinates. His gaze swept across the faces of the people in the council. His heart jumped. He suddenly thought that other than Wang Qinian's discerning eyes, how could there be so many elites within the Overwatch Council that have been buried for so many years and covered in dust for so many years, waiting for him to come from Danzhou to Jingdou before they were discovered? Did Wang Qinian really have such a sharp eye? Or was it that these loyal subordinates had always been suppressed by the old ancestor of the Overwatch Council and left for him to use now? Fan Xian's brows furrowed, and his heart became a mess. Thinking of Chun Pingping's kindness to him, he was speechless for a long time. He sighed, but he didn't have time to ask these subordinates anything. He waved his hand and walked into the quiet room beside the well at the back of the council. There was a large desk in the room. On it were paper envelopes used by the Overwatch Council, as well as a set of tools for making secret words. The inkstone was placed to the right of the desk. The weather in early autumn was not very cold, so it was easy to melt the ink. However, Fan Xian did not grind the ink. Instead, he took out a pencil made by the palace treasury from under the desk and twirled it between 2 fingers. The tip of the pencil did not land on the snow-white paper. After thinking of many ways, he had escaped the eyes of the court and come to this little courtyard. Without question, Fan Xian had already thought clearly about what orders he should give. However, he still put the pencil down. Once anything landed on paper, it was a weakness and the possibility of it being leaked. In the winter of the 6th year of the Qin calendar, he often came to this little courtyard. At that time, Si Lily's brother was still being held hostage by him. At that time, Haitang was still in the little courtyard in the north urging Xija to pull the mill. At that time, Fan Xian often wrote letters to Haitang. Thinking about it carefully, Although he was fighting fiercely with the eldest princess and the second prince in the capital, his state of mind was actually calm and happy. Now that Haitang Doduo had become an enemy of the Qing kingdom on the grasslands and Xijia had been forced to disappear in Shangjing, Fan Xian's state of mind had long changed. All of the members of the Qinian unit stood in the room, silently waiting for Fan Xian to give his orders. In a moment, leave Jingdo immediately. Before you receive my written orders, you are not allowed to return. Fan Xian didn't spend much time sorting out his emotions. Staring at everyone, he said in a heavy tone, "This is the first order. You must survive." "Yes," everyone replied in a low voice. Then, under the indication of Fan Xian's gaze, they left, leaving only 2 people. The Qinian unit had been under Wang Qinian's control for the first 3 years. Later, it was handed over to Deng Ziyu. After Deng Ziyuan in northern Qi, Fan Xian personally managed it. Mu Feng was only responsible for personal matters. There were not many people in the unit. Many had died in the turmoil these years. Presently, some of them were with Deng Ziyu in Shiliang, some were with Su Wanmao in Jiangnan and North Min, and a large portion had been left behind by Fan Xian and Dongyi. The ones still in Jingdo were the only subordinates Fan Xian could directly use. Because of this, Fan Xian didn't want them to lose any more people. Fan Xian stared at one of the 2 people in the room and took out a jade hook from his clothes. Handing it over, he said, "Go to Qingzhou. Don't alert the people of the 4th Bureau. Follow Xiao Mingji's merchant group directly into the grasslands and find Hugo. Tell him that I need him to launch a feint attack at the end of autumn and trap the Qingzhou and Dingzhou armies in Shiliang Road." The official accepted the jade hook and straightforwardly said, "The left virtuous prince has been dead for almost a year. Although Hugo has your secret support and has gathered a lot of power, I'm afraid he doesn't have the power to persuade the Hu people to brave the dangerous weather of late autumn and early winter to attack the Qing kingdom." Everyone knew that it was not easy for Fan Xian to come out, so these subordinates did not hide their opinions. Instead, they did their best to express their intentions as quickly and completely as possible. It is just a feint attack. Besides, he wants revenge. If he can exhaust the strength of the court and the right virtuous prince, he will certainly be willing, Fan Xian said. As for the problem of not having enough power, tell him that I will arrange for the people of the court to stand on his side. But, presumably, the news from Jingdo will also reach the grasslands. Once Hugen knows that you have lost power, will he tear up the original agreement in Dingzhou? The official who accepted the jade hook still fully expressed his opinion. Fan Xian did not show a trace of impatience and said, "Hugo is a smart person. He will have to place his bet on me." He glanced at the jade hook in the official's hand and shook his head. If he wants the owner of the jade hook to live. The jade hook was a childhood accessory of the last princess of the Hu tribe on the grasslands, Ma Sisa. When Fan Xian had met Hugo in Dingzhou, she had given it to him. The token this time was the second one. Although Ma Sisa had been placed in the great prince's manor, her identity still belonged to Baiyue brothel. No matter how much power Fan Xian had lost, it would not be difficult for him to deal with this weak woman. The official thought for a moment and felt that the director's orders had not missed anything. He put the jade hook into his clothes, left the study, and left the little courtyard. As for how this member of the Qinian unit would escape Jingdo, cross Qingzhou, enter the grasslands, and make contact with Hugo, that was his problem. Fan Xian trusted in the abilities of these subordinates. Go to Dingzhou, enter the general's manor, and find the heir, Hong Cheng. Fan Xian's clothes were like a treasure chest. He took out another piece of paper. The writing on the paper was faintly a poem. "This is a token. Jingdo is in turmoil, and I have been chased out of the Overwatch Council." He must have received the news early. He probably won't believe the token of the Overwatch Council and the token of the Qinian unit. Show him this piece of paper, and he will know you are one of my people. This piece of paper was torn from a book. The book was a collection of poems from the previous dynasty. This was a gift the second prince had given to Fan Xian through Hong Cheng many years ago when Fan Xian was spending the winter in the Tsang Mountains. Many people had probably long forgotten, but Fan Xian knew Hongsheng would not. Tell Hongsheng everything I said earlier about Hu Gu and the news that the Hu people will invade at the beginning of winter. Have him prepare, but try to fight as hard as possible. Fan Xian furrowed his brows slightly. Yes, he should be able to understand my intentions now. I just want to find a way for him not to be summoned back to Jingdo. He should know what to do. I just want to remind him that the two sides need to cooperate well. I am giving him this seemingly hard-to-chew bone, but it is actually a delicious piece of fatty meat. Don't let the Hu people take advantage of it. Yes, sir. The official accepted the order and left. People came out, and people came in. Fan Xian methodically used the members of the Qinian unit to convey his will to the powers under heaven that he cared about and could influence. Go to Dongyi and find Mu Feng first. Tell him my intentions. The rebellion in the Liang Kingdom can be used a little. Keep that fire about the same size. Don't burn too fiercely and don't extinguish it too quickly. After this is done, go see 13th Wang and tell him I am waiting for him in Jingdo. Fan Xian sat behind the desk and furrowed his brows slightly. Inciting internal strife in Dongyi could drag the great royal brother there. However, it would be unfair to 13th Wang, so he could only hide it from him for now. Also, have him use the command sword of the Sword Hut on my behalf to pick out 2 trustworthy people and send them to Jiangnan by Su Wenmao's side. Personally deliver this letter to the great prince's hands. Tell him that everything is fine in Jingdo and that there is no need to rush back. There was some worry between Fan Xian's brows. He could explain his thoughts clearly to Li Hongsheng, but he did not have the confidence to control the great prince. Once the news of Chun Pingping's wretched death reached Dongyi, the great prince's anger would probably not be any less than his. The great prince had called Chun Pingping uncle since he was young. Putting aside the close relationship between Lady Ning and Chun Pingping and the fact that Chun Pingping had protected the great prince in Lady Ning's womb, given the friendship between the great prince and Chun Garden these years, given the great prince's personality, it was possible that he would bring hundreds of soldiers to kill his way back to Jingdo. This was what Fan Xian feared the most. Before he launched his 1,000-li surprise attack back to the capital, the only order he had given was for Mu Feng, and the others to return to Dongyi and tell the great prince not to return to the capital. How could Mu Feng alone stop the great prince's anger? Fan Xian had no choice but to personally write a letter. With sincere words, he begged his fiery big brother, who had inherited his mother's legacy, to barely control his urge to question the emperor and his desire to avenge Qin Pingping and stay obediently in Dongyi. Regardless of whether it was Li Hongsheng, who led troops in Dingzhou, or the great prince, who controlled 10,000 elite troops in Dongyi, they were the only 2 military forces Fan Xian could count on in the Qin Kingdom. However, these elite troops belonged to the Qin Kingdom and the emperor. If these 2 young people of the royal family were summoned back to Jingdo, then Fan Xian would have no hope at all. Fan Xian absolutely believed that as long as Li Hongsheng and the great prince returned to the capital, the man sitting on the throne would not give them any opportunity to lead soldiers in the next few years. This was precisely because of their relationship with Fan Xian and Chun Pingping. The order sent to Jiangnan to warn Su Wenmao had also been sent. Other than his identity as a member of the Qinian unit, Su Wenmao was also an official of the court's palace treasury transport company. Furthermore, the palace treasury was of utmost importance to Fan Xian, the Qin Kingdom, and the emperor. No one would let go of it. Thus, Su Wenmao could not hide himself or leave Jiangnan and Northmen. Thus, his situation was the most dangerous. Fan Xian could only hope that in these few years, Su Wenmao had already raised enough direct subordinates in the 3 workshops. He also hoped that Rinbo and his brother would remember old friendships. From his side, other than having Dongyi's Sword Hut send aces into Jiangnan to protect Su Wenmao's life, there was nothing else he could do. The member of the Qinian unit heading to Jiangnan also shouldered an additional mission. He helped Fan Xian bring a message to Xia Qifei and had him choose a day to come to Jingdo during these 2 months. Having the current master of the Ming family come to Jingdo did not mean that Fan Xian had anything important to give to him. Rather, it was Fan Xian's test of him. After all, when Xia Qifei submitted to him, he submitted to the Qing court he represented in the terrifying Overwatch Council. Now that Fan Xian had lost his power and returned to nobility, and the Overwatch Council had been sealed into a pile of mud, who knew if other thoughts would rise to Xia Qifei's heart? The Ming family was important to Jiangnan and also important to the Cold War between Fan Xian and the emperor. If Xia Qifei thought things through and directly knelt before the throne, what would Fan Xian do? Thus, he had to see just how much loyalty Xia Qifei and the Jiangnan water bandits still had to him. If Xia Qifei had truly forgotten the hard days everyone had spent in Jiangnan, Fan Xian's head lowered slightly. He could only have the Ming family change masters and have Zhaoshang Money House take the lead. Orders were given out one by one. The members of the Qinian unit accepted their orders and left. They did not linger at all. Before long, the lonely and secluded little courtyard was empty. There was only Fan Xian behind the desk and the official in front of him. It appeared particularly quiet. The slightly damp autumn wind blew through the slightly dry air and made the water bucket by the well in the courtyard roll around and make a few noises. Probably no one would have thought that in such an unremarkable courtyard, a young man who had already had all of his official positions taken away and all of his power stripped was giving out order after order with the intention of carrying out a final struggle against the Qing kingdom's powerful national machinery. "Why did you change your name to Hong Yiqing?" Fan Xian asked quietly as he looked at the last remaining official of the Qinian unit. He used his finger to gently stroke the little knife he had just taken out from his clothes. This subordinate was the one who had discovered in Qingzhou that the Northern Qi Emperor had intended to use the North Sea Blade Workshop to provoke a relationship between Fan Xian and the Qing Emperor. This person had performed a great service in Qingzhou and was also one of the first people Wang Qinian had placed in the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian saw that this person was thinking of Lao Wang and had moved him to his side. He had followed him all the way to Dongyi. The last time Fan Xian had returned to the capital to debrief, he had left him in Jingdou to act as liaison. It was because of this that this person now had the opportunity to face Fan Xian one last time and not worry helplessly in Dongyi. I heard that in the past, there was a person called Hong Chongqing. He was valiant and righteous and deeply appreciated by you. In the end, he died in the battle to quell a rebellion in Danzhou. You often think about him. I am not talented, but since I have received your great kindness, I want to repay your kindness with my death. Don't die. Fan Xian sighed. He also thought of Qing Hua, who had died under Yin Xiaoyi's arrow. Qing Hua had survived the hellish situation of the Navy massacring the island and the water birds eating people. In the end, he had not lived more than 2 years with him. He handed the knife to Hong Yiqing, stared into his eyes, and said word by word, "In the end, I kept you here because I have something important to tell you. You have to listen clearly. Don't miss a single word." "Yes, sir." Hong Yiqing felt a glimmer of nervousness. "I've already sent 2 people to Shiliang Road, but Deng Ziyu is still out in the open. The Imperial Court will definitely take him in. Even if he can escape, I need someone to continue the task of the people I've arranged there. You stayed in Qingzhou for a long time and are familiar with Shiliang Road. I'll leave this to you." Hong Yiqing was slightly startled. His throat was a little dry, and his face was slightly hot. He had not thought that the director would give him such an important task as the manager of Shiliang Road. Most importantly, you also have to enter the grasslands, find the king's tent, and find a woman called Songji Xianling. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed. Looking at him, he said each word clearly. Tell her not to worry about Ku He or Dodo. Worry about me first. Have her cooperate with Hu Gu and convince the chief. Hong Yiqing didn't know that Fan Xian had already arranged certain matters on the grasslands. He didn't understand, but he calmly agreed. I chose you because Songji Xianling has seen you before. Fan Xian said calmly with his head lowered. Give this little knife to her. Then, have her leave the grasslands and come to Jingdou to see me. What if she doesn't leave? Hong Yiqing unconsciously asked. Fan Xian raised his head. After a moment of silence, he said, "Just say that I am going to die. It's up to her whether she wants to come or not." These words were said very helplessly and shamelessly. Han Yiqing looked at Fan Xian in a daze. He couldn't understand why the seemingly omnipotent director would say such emotional words. He also couldn't understand what kind of person Songji Xianling was for him to think so highly of her. The moment he accepted the knife, Fan Xian's fingers suddenly froze. He stood up from behind the desk. Han Yiqing only noticed the strangeness a moment later. His face was slightly pale. He pulled out the poisoned dagger from his boots and quietly walked behind the door of the room. There was a strange movement outside the door. In this secluded little courtyard that no outsider knew about, someone had suddenly come. "I'm back. My mind is clear. My mood is very good, very high, very powerful." Chapter 712. Soft footsteps rang out in the courtyard outside the door. The sound was very weak, particularly as the market at the end of the alley was still bustling and would be bustling until dusk. Thus, these weak footsteps were almost drowned out by the faint sounds of bargaining. However, these weak footsteps fell into Fan Xian's ears with unusual clarity. He narrowed his eyes and focused on the movements outside. The middle and ring fingers of his hand unconsciously moved a few times. Only then did he realize that his black dagger had long fallen into the autumn rain in front of the royal palace. He didn't know where it had gone, but he remained calm. He still had full confidence that he could subdue the person outside in one blow. Han Yiqing gripped his dagger tightly as he carefully and silently squatted behind the door. He held his breath as he watched the approaching figure. The figure strangely walked straight to the door and gently knocked twice. Hearing the rhythmic knocking, Han Yiqing's expression clearly relaxed. This was because this was the code used by the Qinian team to identify one's identity. Fan Xian did not relax. He was not completely sure whether or not the Qinian unit had been infiltrated by the court or if they had already made contact with the periphery. After all, from the Dazhou incident and Gao Da's existence, the Emperor's attention to intelligence far exceeded Fan Xian's or Chun Pingping's expectations. Furthermore, the internal court must have hidden many loyal people within the Overwatch Council. Otherwise, Yin Bingyun would not have been able to control that sinister courtyard within 7 days. "It's me," the figure outside the door said in a raspy voice. It seemed to know that there was someone in the room. Hearing this voice, Han Yiqing did not recognize who it was. Fan Xian's expression immediately changed. There was joy, sadness, and surprise. The door was pushed open. A middle-aged man with an unfamiliar face and wearing the clothing of a vegetable farmer commonly seen in the outskirts of Jingdou walked in. "Leader Wang." Han Yiqing lowered his voice and looked in disbelief at the newcomer. From the familiar warm smile in his eyes, he recognized the other person's identity. After all, he had been personally chosen by Wang Qinian to join the unit. He was familiar with Wang Qinian. However, in the hearts of most Overwatch Council officials, Wang Qinian had died 3 years ago because of the Dong Mountain Rebellion. How could he appear alive and well in front of them today? Wang Qinian, in disguise, patted Han Yiqing on the shoulder. Then, he focused and calmed himself. Very seriously, he suppressed his excitement and bowed deeply to Fan Xian, who was standing behind the table. "Let's talk another day. There will be a time when we meet again. Let's go do business." Fan Xian smiled and tossed the knife in his hand to Han Yiqing. At this moment, Han Yiqing still had an unsettled expression on his face, but he knew that the matter was urgent and did not dare to delay any longer. He bowed to the two of them and headed towards the grassland in the west to find the person called Songji Xianling. Fan Xian walked out from behind the table and stood in front of Wang Qinian. He looked at him quietly for a moment and then hugged him. He patted his back forcefully and then straightened his body. He could easily see the exhaustion that Wang Qinian could not hide even after his disguise. Fan Xian gazed at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian also gazed at him. The two of them didn't speak for a long time. After a long time, Fan Xian sighed and said, "It's truly been a long time." On the road back to the capital from Dongyi, Wang Qinian had desperately blocked the Overwatch Council's carriages and informed Fan Xian of the shocking news. At that time, the two of them had no time to say or sigh. Fan Xian had risen and rushed straight to Jingdo to save Qin Pingping. Calculating carefully, it had been exactly 8 days since Fan Xian returned to the capital before Wang Qinian once again rushed back to Jingdo. Before that, Wang Qinian had already made a difficult, flying journey from Dazhou to the northeast. 2 long journeys had truly exhausted Wang Qinian, who was no longer young. Even though he was one of the wings of the Overwatch Council, he was almost at his limit. Fan Xian helped him to a chair and sat down. After a moment of silence, he said, "Where have you been these years?" Fan Xian knew that he hadn't died. He also knew that under Qin Pingping's arrangements, Wang Qinian and his family, who had escaped Dong Mountain, had all concealed their identities. For the safety of the Wang family, Fan Xian had only investigated briefly before giving up on the job. During these 3 years, Fan Xian often thought of him. He thought of his closest subordinate, the cute old Wang who knew the most of his secrets. "I've actually never left the capital. I've always been by the director's side, always watching over you. It's enough that I know you're doing well." Wang Qinian spoke in a raspy voice. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He then said, "I came back late." He was talking about the matter of Qin Pingping. Wang Qinian lowered his head and was also silent for a long time. In a low voice, he said, "It was I who reported too late." In reality, the two of them had already done their best. However, they were still unable to change what had already happened. A faint sense of sorrow and self-blame filled the room. "Oh, that's the family." "Yes, the court shouldn't be able to find out." "That's good. Come back to my side." "Okay." After this extremely natural reply, Fan Xian's heart, which had been cold for a long time, warmed a rare sliver. In a quiet voice, he asked, "I had you follow the group to Dongyi. Why did you come back?" "The 4,500 Black Knights have entered Dongyi territory." "This is probably a very advanced concept," Fan Xian said calmly. "However, he has forgotten that the world is the Emperor's. All of the officials' martial power is the Emperor's private tool." He said with slight mockery, "Unfortunately, our Sir Yin Jr. does not understand this. It is not so easy to be a loyal official and an unfilial son. I hope he can sit more stably in the Overwatch Council in the future." Wang Qinian heard that Fan Xian did not have much resentment toward Yin Bingyan. He narrowed his eyes and said, "What do we do next? You rest first. 10,000 years is too long, but you can't just seize the moment." Fan Xian stood by Wang Qinian's side and gently pressed on his slightly slumped shoulders. In an even voice, he said, "You must be tired these days. Choose a place to stay in the capital. I don't think many people will be able to find you. Then, I have something for you to do." Given Wang Qinian's tracking and hiding abilities, even if the court continued to cast a large net outside the Fan Manor, it probably wouldn't be able to stop him and Fan Xian from meeting. With him, although Fan Xian's body was left in Jingdo, his voice could finally travel out. It would no longer be as difficult as it had been these 7 days. Wang Qinian already knew of the information Fan Xian had sent out through the Qinian unit to various places under heaven. He did not make any suggestions for this plan. He was just not sure if Fan Xian wanted to reveal his cards here, or if he was just passively carrying out a defense, hiding his power outside Jingdo, and waiting for a suitable opportunity to explode out. "I hope Ziyue can come out of Shiliang alive." Fan Xian's brows were slightly melancholic. "I had originally planned on having him return to Northern Qi to do this. However, I've always been worried. After all, even if they're willing to follow me, it is because I am a Qing person. Perhaps in their eyes, I am a member of the royal family. Thus, even when facing the Emperor, they can be confident and confident. However, if it is Northern Qi," he raised his head and looked at Wang Qinian. "If I wanted to take you with me to commit treason, would you come with me?" Wang Qinian smiled bitterly and stood up. "Haven't I done a lot of these things in the past few years? Even if you want to take me into the dirt, I can only go." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Thus, I will only be at ease if you do this." The two of them left the small courtyard one after the other. It was destined that no one would come to this courtyard for a very long time after spending 120 taels of silver on it. Only the lonely raindrops and the lonely cobwebs would accompany the smooth paper and the cold ink. A large hat covered Fan Xian's head. Following the muddy road in the market, he followed Wang Qinyan's figure from a distance. He only relaxed when he finally lost him. For one, it was to confirm that there were no ambushes outside the little courtyard. For another, it was to calm his heart. If even he and Wang Qinyan had lost him, who in Jingdo could follow him? After finishing all of this, Fan Xian's mood relaxed a little. It was like the sky that had finally stopped the autumn rain 3 days ago. Although it had not cleared up and there were still faint black clouds, they could still drift with the wind and let some clear light into the world. They would not be blindly heavy and cold. In the end, the affairs of the world had to be settled. Before the emperor acted, Fan Xian had to do his best to preserve the power in his hands. Only then would he have enough power and weapons when he laid his cards on the table in the future. For some reason, he always felt that he had made a mistake somewhere. The faint wariness was like a cloud that kept turning over and over in his mind, but he could never see its shape clearly. Leaving the market behind him and the bustling, ordinary, and harsh sounds of the marketplace behind him, Fan Xian followed the Jingdo city gates and the radial street that led toward the royal palace toward the south of the city. The matter had already been completed. The people of the Qinian unit had collectively left Jingdo. He didn't need to worry about anything. Even being under house arrest in the manor was not an unbearable pain. However, he had to pass the royal palace on the way. Passing the royal palace in the distance, Fan Xian couldn't stop the pain. He forced himself not to think about the scenes from a few days ago. He couldn't help but begin to think about how his sister was doing in the palace. Although Eunuch Dai had said that the emperor treated Ruo like a child, Ruo's present identity was, after all, a hostage. She knew that her days in the palace would be difficult. This was the emperor's light brush stroke, but it directly tore apart the picture scroll that Fan Xian had worked so hard to paint. It was impossible for Fan Xian to leave Jingdo. It was all because of this. It was raining. Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and let his clothes and hat cover the fine raindrops. Silently, he left under the gaze of the royal palace. This place was strictly guarded. There were not many people on the streets, but he could hear a few curses about the weather. Presumably, the continuous autumn rain had only stopped for 2 days and had fallen again. This made the people of Jingdo very dissatisfied. There were times when dissatisfaction turned into numbness from habit. The rain was not heavy. Fan Xian walked silently toward the manor like a prisoner forced into prison. There was truly nothing he could do. As he walked, he thought. He compared the person in the royal palace to himself in all aspects. In the end, he placed his thoughts on the hemp-clothed ascetic monks. From the moment Qin Pingping returned to the capital to his imprisonment to Fan Xian's charge into the execution field, the hemp-clothed ascetic monks had suddenly appeared in the royal palace, the Overwatch Council, and the execution field. Although these ascetic monks were powerful, it was not enough to make Fan Xian's heart tremble. However, he did not understand. Furthermore, because of these ascetic monks, he thought of the illusory temple that Fan Xian knew existed. The Qin kingdom had always maintained a respectful distance from the path of the gods. It was not like northern Xi, where Tianyi Dao permeated the officialdom and people. Particularly after the appearance of the powerful emperor, the status of the Qin temple in the Qin kingdom's life took a sudden turn for the worse. It completely became an accessory and decoration. The small number of Qin temple ascetic monks scattered throughout the world became an object forgotten by people. Why had these forgotten people appeared in Jingdo, by the emperor's side? Did the emperor already have complete control of the Qin temple? However, the great priest of the Qin temple had died strangely. The second priest, Great Master Sanshi, had died hopelessly. More than half of the priests of the Qin temple on Dong Mountain had died to the emperor's anger. Why had these ascetic monks of the Qin temple completely fallen to the emperor's side? Was it truly as Qin Pingping had said? He had faintly guessed that the emperor back then had truly come into contact with the will of the temple. Was it because of this that these ascetic monks did not hold a grudge of many years and stood by the emperor's side to help him shine in this world? The rain did not grow heavier. There were opportunities in heaven and earth. When Fan Xian shook off his thoughts from the fine rain and unconsciously raised his head, he saw the Qing temple not far in front of him. It was the Qing temple, completely black with hidden green eaves, by the desolate and quiet side of the street, receiving the rain from the heavens and not stirring up a speck of dust. It had long walls on the outside and a round tower inside. Fan Xian stared in a daze at this delicate and pretty building. He didn't know what to feel. In this temple, he had once brushed shoulders with the emperor. He had once seen a girl who loved to nibble on chicken legs under the curtains. He had also carefully studied the strange murals painted under the eaves. However, he had never understood any of the things he truly wanted to understand. He should have returned to his manor. At this moment, he unconsciously walked up the steps. Passing through the rarely closed temple door, he walked directly into the temple. Under the accompaniment of the fine autumn rain, he slowly walked through the temple. The tiredness and resentment these days had miraculously lessened. He didn't know if it was the wondrous atmosphere of the Qing temple itself or if it was the quiet space. It was so quiet that it made one lazy to think. Very naturally, he walked to the back of the temple. Fan Xian's figure suddenly froze. He saw an ascetic monk wearing hemp clothing and a straw hat looking at him with furrowed brows at the door of the small building in the back of the temple. Fan Xian wanted to retreat, but the ascetic monk opened his mouth. The moment he opened his mouth, it was filled with admiration. His hands pressed together toward the raindrops in the sky. He sighed and said, "The will of heaven has its own encounters. Master Fan, we have always wanted to go find you. Unexpectedly, you have come." Having his true identity seen through, Fan Xian's expression did not change. Calmly, he looked at the ascetic monk and quietly said, "You? Why are you looking for me?" The ascetic monk held a bell in his right hand. He gently rang it. The clear sound of the bell quickly pierced through the fine rain and spread throughout the entire Qing temple. Just like the first time Fan Xian had come to the Qing temple, there was no incense burning in the temple. Other than tourists from various provinces, probably no one wanted to come here. Thus, the Qing temple was still quiet. The clear sound of the bell did not cause any unusual movement. It only attracted a dozen ascetic monks. Wearing the same style of hemp clothing and similar old straw hats, the ascetic monks walked out from all directions of the Qing temple and faintly surrounded Fan Xian in the center, just below the round tower. Fan Xian slowly took a deep breath and began to slowly circulate the Jinqi meridians that had never stopped in the two circulations of his body. Coldly, he looked at the ascetic monk in front of him and calmly said, "This temple has always been quiet. You are not preaching under heaven. Why have you come back to disturb the peace here?" Sir Fan has a kind heart and is deeply endowed with the virtue of heaven. In Jiangnan, you cultivate in Hangzhou and gather the wealth of the world to enrich the river works. We useless people travel through various provinces and have heard of Sir's benevolence and seen much of Sir's kindness. We have long hoped to meet you." The ascetic monk lowered his head in greeting. He had always called Fan Xian Sir Fan and not Sir Fan. That was because everyone in Jingdo knew that all of Fan Xian's official positions had been stripped by the emperor. "I don't think you have come specially to praise me." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and furrowed his brows slightly. He had truly not thought that when he entered the temple to take a look, he would encounter such a group of strange people. Was it truly, as the ascetic monk had said, that everything was fated? However, these strange ascetic monks truly seemed to have come specially to praise Fan Xian. They took off their straw hats and respectfully knelt down in front of Fan Xian in the center. Bowing, they sincerely praised and prayed for blessings. Fan Xian's expression was indifferent, but his heart was greatly shaken. The fine rain and the sound of praying mingled together. The atmosphere was very strange. The ascetic monks did not have the habit of wearing shoes. Their rough feet had been soaked in the rain until they were white. They knelt together on the wet ground and looked as laughable as frogs. However, the powerful aura emanating from their bodies and the words they said were not laughable. This powerful aura was the aura of these dozen ascetic monks after they had harmonized. It was so pure that no one dared to underestimate it. Sincere words like chanting a mantra rang out in the rain, accompanied by a dozen shiny bald heads in the rain. It was very annoying. For the sake of the people of the world, we beg that Sir Fan enter the palace to ask for forgiveness and comfort the emperor's heart. Fan Xian's face paled slightly. In an instant, he knew what these ascetic monks wanted to do. The estrangement and dispute between the Qing emperor and Fan Xian, ruler and official, father and son, had already continued for 7 days. Neither side had shown any signs of retreat. For the sake of the people of the world, naturally, someone had to admit their wrongs, and someone had to retreat. The Qing kingdom could only allow one dazzling leader. In the eyes of these ascetic monks, this person was the great emperor. The ascetic monks acutely sensed the Qing kingdom's greatest danger. For some reason, they decided to persuade Fan Xian on behalf of the emperor. In their hearts, and even in the hearts of the people, as long as Fan Xian once again returned to the emperor's light, the Qing kingdom and the world would certainly have an even better future. What if I am not willing? Fan Xian looked at these monks he had not had much contact with and asked quietly. There was a death-like silence. Only the fine rain continued to fall, landing on the ascetic monks' bald heads. The rain on the eaves dripped onto the stone tiles of the Qing temple. After a long time, a dozen voices, thick and thin, big and small, but all of them were incomparably determined and holy, rang out. For the sake of the people of the world, please rest in peace. Chapter 7:13. For the sake of all life under heaven, please rest in peace. Hearing these words in the rain, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh. His laugh was not exaggerated. The corners of his delicate and pretty face that was half exposed outside the hat curled up slightly, carrying a glimmer of disdain and a glimmer of absurdity. This was his truest reaction in his heart. Probably even he had not thought that entering the Qing temple in the rain would meet these ascetic monks. Furthermore, the temperament these ascetic monks exuded was so strange. What was the temple? There were not many people in the world who knew. The only person who had some understanding of that indistinct place was, without question, Fan Xian, who had accompanied Xiao in death. In the days after his rebirth, he had guessed this question more than once. However, he had never been able to find any fundamental answers. Fan Xian knew many of the priests, ascetic monks, and monks who served the temple. Among them, the most famous was, without question, the imperial advisor of Northern Qi, the person in charge of Tianyi Dao, Master Ku He. Presumably, even Master Ku He would not think that he had accepted the will of the temple and would punish on behalf of heaven just because he pitied the toil of the common people. Yet, the ascetic monks in the rain in front of him were serious and resolute in saying such words. Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh coldly to himself. Why must it be me who rests in peace, and not someone else? Fan Xian slowly withdrew the smile on his face. Looking at the ascetic monks around him, he calmly asked, if there's a God in the world, presumably in his eyes, all life is equal. Since that is the case, why must you target me? Could it be that the ascetic monks who serve the temple are nothing more than scoundrels who bully the weak and fear the strong? These mocking words clearly had no effect on the ascetic monks. They continued to kneel calmly around Fan Xian's body, as if they were worshipping him. However, the pure aura that had already condensed into one had already firmly controlled Fan Xian's figure in the field. It's not difficult for me to enter the palace to ask for forgiveness, but I need an explanation. Why am I the sinner? Fan Xian slowly pulled off the rain hat connected to his collar and allowed the weak raindrops to slowly flow down his smooth black hair. Seriously, he said, I originally didn't know that you, who were so unknown, were such fanatics. I can also understand the meaning you didn't say. It is nothing more than to unify the world and dispel decades of unease and the fires of war so that the people can live in peace. I don't understand. What makes you think that man will be able to perfectly fulfill your hopes and carry out the will of the temple? Fan Xian turned his body slightly and felt that the heavy atmosphere around him was like a living thing. It was very smooth, without a trace of stagnation, nor did it reveal any loopholes that could be exploited. He raised his eyebrows slightly. He had not thought that these ascetic monks would be able to combine their individual realms of power to form such a powerful force when they worked together. Perhaps this was the reason the emperor had summoned these outwardly wooden but inwardly fanatical ascetic monks back to Jingdou. From the first step into the Qing temple, if Fan Xian wanted to escape the encirclement of these ascetic monks, he should have reacted at the first instant. However, he had already missed that opportunity and sunk into a heavy encirclement. Perhaps he had underestimated the power of the ascetic monks. More importantly, it was because he wanted to talk to the ascetic monks. Through these conversations, he could understand some things he wanted to understand, such as why the ascetic monks of the Qing temple supported the Qing emperor with all their might, completely ignoring the pressure the court and royal palace had put on the Qing temple these years, and whether or not the emperor had any connection to that illusory temple. In the rain, a dozen ascetic monks changed from kneeling to sitting cross-legged. They continued to surround Fan Xian in the center. Their expressions were wooden. It was as if they were no longer bothered by external things. There was a long silence. Perhaps these ascetic monks still hoped that Sir Fan could be convinced by them and not cause the Qing kingdom, which was about to unify the world, to sink into turmoil. Thus, a voice rang out in front of Fan Xian. An ascetic monk put his palms together. Raindrops hung on his weak eyelashes. He said slowly, "Your Majesty is a person who has received the heavenly revelation. We wanderers should help your Majesty unify the world and benefit the people." Tianqi? When? Fan Xian asked with his hands behind his back. His expression did not change as he stared at the ascetic monk's old face. He could easily see that these ascetic monks were not young anymore. Decades ago, a voice rang out from behind Fan Xian. The answer was very vague. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and began to think quickly. "Did an envoy pass on the temple's will to you?" Fan Xian asked. "Yes." This time, it was another ascetic monk who answered. His answer was clean and tidy, without the slightest hesitation. However, this answer made Fan Xian's eyes narrow even more. The temple occasionally sent an envoy to the world. This was in itself one of this land's greatest secrets. If he had not grown up by Uncle Wu Zhu's side and learned so many secrets from Xiao En and Chen Pingping, he would not have been able to ask these questions. However, these ascetic monks were not surprised to hear the word envoy from Fan Xian. It was as if they had long expected that Fan Xian knew some of the temple's secrets. This matter surprised Fan Xian. But the great priest is dead. Sanshur is also dead. Your companions on Dong Mountain are also dead. Fan Xian continued to speak calmly. Even the autumn rain could not hide the viciousness and mockery in his tone. Who wouldn't die? Then, why didn't you die? Because the emperor still needs us. It sounds like you're very much like the girls in my brothel. The atmosphere in the Qing temple in the rain was strange. Fan Xian continued to calmly and continuously ask questions. The ascetic monks sitting around him each answered his questions. Their answers were wooden, steady, and orderly. They opened their mouths one by one. Of the 16 people present, it was as if only one person answered. Fan Xian's heart gradually sank. It looked like these strange ascetic monks had practiced hard for many years and had reached a powerful realm in the art of connecting their minds. What chilled him even more was the information regarding the emissary of the temple. The last time the temple envoy had come to the world was in the 5th year of the Qing calendar. This envoy had come ashore from the south. Along the way, he had indifferently learned the customs and habits of human society like a wild beast. In the process of this habit, many people in the southern provinces of the Qing kingdom had died at the hands of this envoy. Perhaps it was a habitual indifference to life, or perhaps this envoy wanted to hide the news of his existence. In any case, the 13 Yamans of the Ministry of Justice had paid a great price and still hadn't been able to touch even a corner of this mysterious envoy's clothing. At the time, the Qing court only saw this person as a ruthless criminal with superb martial skills and didn't know his true identity. That was why the Ministry of Justice later asked the Overwatch Council for help. Yin Bingyan was cautious and asked Fan Xian to borrow the Tiger Guard. Before the Overwatch Council could act, this temple envoy had already arrived in Jingdo. He came to the alley beside the Fan Manor and was stopped by Wu Zhu beside a noodle stand. After a battle between commoner grandmasters, the temple envoy died and Wu Zhu was heavily injured. He disappeared and spent many years recovering on Dong Mountain. The remains of this emissary of the temple were burned in the Qing temple. Fan Xian's gaze passed through the curtain of rain toward the barren plain behind the Qing temple. His gaze was slightly cold. He thought of the scene of the emperor and the great priest looking at the temple envoy in the fire. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The great priest of the Qing temple had been preaching in the swamps and wastelands to the south of the Qing kingdom. Coincidentally, he returned to the capital not long before the temple envoy entered the capital. Then, not long after the envoy melted into the fire, he died of a serious illness. Was this a coincidence? Of course not. At least, Fan Xian didn't believe it. The matter of Uncle Wu Zhu being injured and the arrival of the emissary of the temple were things he only learned later. After a long time, he could only vaguely find this far. At least, it proved that the emperor had certainly reached some kind of agreement with the emissary from the temple through the great priest of the Qing temple. In the 5th year of the Qing calendar, the emperor hoped to use his illegitimate child as bait to lure the temple envoy and Uncle Wu Zhu into mutual destruction. However, he did not achieve his goal. In order to bury this matter and not let Fan Xian know of it, the great priest had to die. Fan Xian withdrew his gaze and looked at the ascetic monks in front of him. Naturally, he thought of the so-called Tianqi and the will transmitted by the temple emissary. That emissary was presumably the one who came to the Qing kingdom 22 years ago. Looking at it now, that envoy had not only moved Uncle Wu Zhu out of Jingdo, he had also represented the illusory temple and reached some kind of cooperation with the emperor. Cooperation between the emperor and the temple? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. The first time they worked together, they killed Yi Qingmei. The second time they worked together, they almost killed Uncle Wu Zhu. Everything was actually already very clear. The only thing he didn't understand was why the temple, which ostensibly did not interfere in worldly affairs, would make such a choice in the human world. The ascetic monks surrounding Fan Xian in the Qing temple were all rather old. Over 20 years ago, they had already learned of the temple's will. In their wild joy, they had loyally thrown themselves into the ranks of the Qing emperor's service. During these 20 years, they had walked among the people, spreading what should be good teachings. They ate one mouthful at a time, drank one ladle at a time, and lived a hard but peaceful life. At the same time, presumably, they were also acting as secret agents for the emperor. Dongyi had submitted. The civil strife had been quelled. Qin Pingping had died. The weather was favorable. The people were at peace. The country was rich, and the army was strong. The Qing kingdom's power had reached its peak. Other than Fan Xian, it seemed that there was no one else who could stop the Qing emperor's march to unify the world. Thus, these ascetic monks returned to Jingdo and prepared to welcome that dazzling moment. Thus, the ascetic monks wanted to persuade Fan Xian to forget his personal grudge for this great cause. For the sake of the righteousness of the world, he would forget one person's sorrow. Fan Xian stood alone in the rain. Although the rain was light, it still gradually soaked through his clothes. These ascetic monks frankly told him what they had done these 20 years and explained the secrets hidden behind the Qing kingdom's history. They sincerely wanted to persuade him. They wanted to use the will of the temple, the people's submission, and the direction of the general trend to persuade Fan Xian not to make an enemy of the emperor. The emperor was a wise ruler chosen by heaven and the ruler of the world. It's all nonsense. Fan Xian shook his head helplessly and wiped the rain from his face. Looking at the ascetic monks around him who were pleading with him, he said, "What exactly does this have to do with me? I'm just an official of His Majesty. No, I'm just a commoner now. I don't think anyone in the world would think that I can affect the general situation of the world. Isn't it a bit overreacting to force me into the palace or to send me to the grave?" The ascetic monks met each other's eyes and saw the caution and determination in each other's eyes. They did not believe Fan Xian's words. One of them looked at Fan Xian and said sincerely, "Because you are her son." Fan Xian was silent. He finally knew why the great array in the Qing temple had come. If the ascetic monks in the Qing temple served the temple loyally and saw the emperor as a leader chosen by heaven, then, without question, Yi Qingmei, the young girl who had escaped the temple and stolen many things from the temple, was their greatest enemy. Perhaps these ascetic monks did not know the inside story and did not need to know. They only needed the temple emissary from 20 years ago to determine the nature of Yi Qingmei's actions for them to be deeply afraid of the woman who dared to look down on the temple. This kind of fear continued until 20 years later when it extended to Fan Xian. "If you kill me, what will the emperor think?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "I think he must be very unwilling to see his son die in the hands of you swindlers. I am very worried for you." All of the ascetic monks saluted in unison with unswerving expressions on their faces. No one replied, but the meaning they expressed was clear. For the sake of their goal, even if the emperor killed them all afterward, they would keep Fan Xian here forever. "I've heard everything I wanted to hear." The corner of Fan Xian's mouth twitched, and he said with slight mockery, "I think that if I agree to enter the palace, presumably you won't be at ease and will place some restrictions on my body. Of course, I can feign civility and agree to it first. At least I can keep my life. It's just that you've misjudged one thing." Fan Xian gazed at them coldly and said, "I believe in the existence of the temple more than you do. It is precisely because of this that my legs will not weaken the moment I hear the name of the temple and kneel in the rain like you." An ascetic monk sighed deeply and said, bemoaning the state of the universe and pitying the fate of mankind, "People are born in this world and must always be fearful. The emperor once said these words to me." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and thought to himself that it was clear that the emperor did not fear anything. The temple? Emissary? These existences that mortals saw as illusory and terrifying were probably nothing more than a kind of power that could be used in the emperor's eyes. Respect the heavens and the earth, but you cannot respect the will of others, Fan Xian said. Concerning this point, you should learn from Master Ku He. The ascetic monks were slightly surprised. They did not understand what these words meant. However, they saw Fan Xian, surrounded in the center, float up. Fan Xian floated up in the fine autumn rain. The cloth robes on his body were slowly held up by Jinqi. Like a heartless bird, with a sudden sound, he swept toward the outskirts of the Qing temple. Without any warning, it was as if Fan Xian's body was being pulled by an invisible long rope and floated toward the main doors of the Qing temple with astonishing speed. His speed in the air was incomparably fast, and his movements were particularly gentle. He moved through the rain like a swallow, rolling and floating away in the wind and rain. However, his body had only swept out 50 feet when he felt an incomparably thick wall of air pouncing toward him. The moment Fan Xian made his move, a dozen ascetic monks moved at the same time. One ascetic monk put his arm around another ascetic monk's shoulder. With a muffled grunt, he tossed the companion beside him out. 6 or 7 consecutive movements were executed smoothly. It was as if their minds had long been connected. These movements did not show any signs of being sluggish or out of place. The ascetic monk's formation was an irregular circle. At this moment, they were tossed together. 7 people were quickly tossed toward the main doors of the Qing temple. In the air, their hands did not leave, causing the ascetic monks below to move at the same time. It was like a wave. The irregular circle formed by a dozen ascetic monks instantly became one. It flipped in the drizzling air and rose into the air. Using the wave-like aura, it leaped over Fan Xian's rapidly flying figure and once again trapped him in the circle. A circle flipped in the air and then landed on the ground. It was still a circle. Fan Xian was still in the center of the circle. After a moment, the rain continued to fall. The situation did not seem to have changed at all, other than everyone moving about 70 feet toward the main doors of the Qing temple. The ascetic monks did not give Fan Xian any chance to attack first. They chanted in unison. Countless pairs of powerful jinqi and determined palms slammed toward Fan Xian's body. No one knew what secret method the ascetic monks practiced to be able to connect their minds and perfectly merge their true power together. The countless palms slammed forward like a shining god. In an instant, countless pairs of divine hands appeared. Indifferently and mercilessly, they wanted to eliminate the demon in front of them. All of the space around Fan Xian was covered by the shadows of palms that blocked out the sky and the rain. It was like a large net falling down. It was impossible to see any gaps. This was the so-called beauty of harmony. When beautiful to the extreme, it was dangerous to the extreme. The wall of qi crashed toward him. Fan Xian forcefully twisted his body in the air. He forcefully absorbed the flow of air around him that he could feel from every inch of his skin. He forcefully circulated 2 great circulations. His body was forced to land on the ground, but the tip of his foot touched the wet ground. Tyrannical jinqi gathered in his fist. He threw a punch toward the most powerful point in the thick wall of qi. In the instant that he was forced back into the harmonious situation, Fan Xian deeply smelled the scent of danger. 8 days ago, he had charged into the Jingdo execution field. He had stabbed an ascetic monk to death and forced back another. At the time, he had also paid the price of being hit 3 times. However, it was clear that the ascetic monks on the execution field had not displayed their greatest power. Fan Xian knew where the ascetic monks' power lay. It was in their ability to perfectly gather their individual power into one. This was not a group fight. It was not even the perfect teamwork of the Sword Hut disciples. On the contrary, it was more like the murderous light condensed between the Tiger Guard's long knives. When these ascetic monks formed a harmony, regardless of which ascetic monk Fan Xian faced, it was the same as facing them as a whole. In Fan Xian's eyes, the invisible wall of qi in front of him was as clear as a wall of white fog of varying thicknesses. He did not consider the consequences at all. He directly gathered all the jinqi in his body and struck out with a tyrannical force. The place he struck was the thickest part of the wall of qi. Using the strongest against the strongest, Fan Xian completely ignored the shadows of the palms that filled the sky. He knew that given his present strength, the other party would have to gather all of them together in order to be able to stand up to them. This was probably the rare, powerful aura that a warrior had nurtured after experiencing a lot. As expected, Fan Xian struck out violently toward the wall of qi. The palms that filled the sky immediately disappeared. The shadow of one hand and the shadow of another quickly merged into one. Dozens of palms finally merged into one, a sparkling and glowing palm. This palm collided viciously with Fan Xian's tightly clenched fist. The air in the Qing temple seemed to change shape with this collision. The fine drifting autumn rain was shaken into the air. On the large plain, not a single drop of rain could fall. The entire air was filled with a dry and murderous aura. After a loud crash, the clothes on Fan Xian's right shoulder were torn to shreds and flew up like butterflies, revealing his trembling right arm. The face of the ascetic monk he was facing was strangely red and bright. There were 2 arms on each of his shoulders. A dozen ascetic monks were endlessly channeling jinqi into his body along this bridge of qi to help him resist Fan Xian's tyrannical punch. Fan Xian's face was deathly pale. The jinqi in his body spat out violently, but he was still unable to break through his opponent's encirclement. The jinqi coming from his opponent's palm was endless. It was like a wave, imposing, and incomparably turbulent. It gave one a feeling that it was difficult to resist. With a splat, the ascetic monk facing Fan Xian's palm spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. It dripped down along his clothes. However, the ascetic monk's face grew redder and brighter. There was no sign of exhaustion or of being unable to bear the majestic Xinqi in his body. He only carried a trace of pity as he looked at Fan Xian in front of him. It was as if he was waiting for him to admit defeat, disperse his martial arts, and submit. The ascetic monk walked and cultivated painstakingly in the most bitter places in the world. The tempering of the body and spirit indeed created an extraordinary cultivation. Signs of defeat had already appeared, but Fan Xian's eyes remained icy cold. There was not a trace of panic. There wasn't even the excitement of fighting for his life. There was only calmness. Calmly, he looked at the ascetic monk close to him and stared into his shining eyes. It was as if he wanted to see the color he hoped for in his eyes. Only Fan Xian knew that with just this exchange of fist and palm, the meridians in his body had been shaken to an unbearable state. His large and small circulation spun rapidly as he desperately exhaled Xinqi along his fist. He was almost unable to hold on. In particular, the vital point of the mountain at his waist was beginning to heat up faintly. It was a sign of exhaustion. After all, it was an injured and weak body. Fan Xian's most vital point was there. He had only rested for a few days in the Fan Manor. During these few days, he had viciously used martial arts to kill people. His state of mind had not calmed down. He had not recovered to his peak. Fortunately, his meridians were different from those of a normal person. He had one more circulation than a normal person. That was why he could use his weak body to hold on for so long in front of the ascetic monk's harmonious power. If it had been 13th Wang or Haidang, they probably would not have fared better than him. However, Fan Xian still did not panic or despair. He only looked coldly into the ascetic monk's bright black eyes. Finally, just as Fan Xian was about to be unable to hold on, a wretched green color finally appeared in the eyes of the ascetic monk close to Fan Xian's fist and palm. It was a wretched green color that was completely at odds with the eyes of a normal person. Then, two streams of black blood slowly flowed out of the ascetic monk's nostrils. The ascetic monks around Fan Xian did not notice this. They only sat cross-legged in the surroundings with their heads lowered in meditation, endlessly activating the resilient Xinqi in their bodies. A glimmer of understanding flashed through the wretched green eyes of the ascetic monk with the black blood flowing out. Glancing at Fan Xian, he finally understood why the young man in front of him was willing to listen to their pleas earlier in the rain. He was using this autumn rain to spread the poison. The ascetic monk finally remembered Fan Xian's true teacher. He was the last disciple of that old poisonous creature. The ascetic monk felt as if his internal organs were being bitten by insects. His throat began to hurt, and the corners of his eyes began to grow numb. He knew that the poison in his body was beginning to act up. If he stopped now, presumably, he could use the Xinqi in his body to suppress the poison. However, it was impossible for a colorless, odorless, and insoluble poison powder to be too terrifying. This was an innate principle of nature and common sense that all martial cultivators knew. The ascetic monk also knew this. Thus, he was not worried about his fellow disciples. Other than him, who had faced Fan Xian head-on and thus had the poison take effect the fastest, the other disciples should be able to hold out longer. The ascetic monk did not want Fan Xian to leave because he had already discovered that Fan Xian could not hold on much longer. A glimmer of peace flashed through his wretched green eyes, as well as a glimmer of determination. With a muffled grunt, he completely abandoned the defense of his state of mind and opened up all of his meridians, allowing the Xinqi to pour in from both sides. Then, he pushed it along his arm toward Fan Xian's bare right arm. All of it was done in one palm. He was willing to use his death to exchange for Fan Xian's death and the prosperity of the Qin kingdom. However, Fan Xian was not willing. A biting coldness flashed through his eyes. He knew that the ascetic monk had forcefully activated his Xinqi. The poison had entered his heart and could no longer be saved. He sunk his Jinshi into his lower body and relaxed his right shoulder slightly. Using the power of the coffin breaker technique, he prepared to use his right arm to exchange for the death of the ascetic monk, the eye of the array, and then escape. Faced with this dangerous situation of death, Fan Xian had the willpower and courage to break his arm to survive. Other than Fan Xian, there were other people in this world who did not want to see Fan Xian die. The heart-chilling circle in the autumn rain rolled in a circle in the air. It was getting closer to the front door of the Qing Temple. At this most dangerous moment, the two words on the sign behind the Qing Temple's front door suddenly dimmed. It was not that the sky had dimmed or that the two golden words had suddenly rusted. Rather, a shadow floated up and covered some of the light from the two words. In an instant, the shadow passed through the rain and floated to the back of the ascetic monk facing Fan Xian without any obstruction. Miraculously, the shadow spread out behind the man's neck. For limbs grew out and a sword grew out. With a hiss, the tip of the sword pierced into the ascetic monk's neck like a venomous snake and came out through the soft bones of his throat. The sharp blade had already cut through the ascetic monk's windpipe, esophagus, and blood vessels. The ascetic monk did not make any sound. He only stared fixedly at Fan Xian in front of him. The wretched green in his eyes was very strong, but his pupils did not shrink. It was as if he wanted to use his gaze to kill Fan Xian in front of him. At the same time the shadow formed the sword, Fan Xian's empty and powerless left hand rose up with difficulty. His fingertips dug slightly, and the hidden crossbow bolt broke out of his sleeve. It pierced deeply into the ascetic monk's left eye, sending up a spray of blood. This ascetic cultivator had the lifetime cultivation of a dozen ascetic cultivators gathered on his body. He was extremely powerful and thick. However, when he was attacked by two vicious killing moves at the same time, he still paused in the end. It was this pause that allowed Fan Xian's left arm to twist strangely. His shoulder shook and swung. The coffin breaker came out again and viciously smashed the end of the hidden crossbow bolt, smashing it deep into the ascetic monk's brain. The tip of the bolt went deep and in his life. With a whoosh, the rain became chaotic. The ascetic monk, who had sacrificed himself for benevolence, lowered his hand in disappointment. Fan Xian opened his fist into a palm and brushed it against the top of his head. His entire body floated up. His left hand grabbed the shadow's clothes. Using his fastest speed, he sliced through the rain and left the Qing Temple in an instant. From the time the two small golden characters on the horizontal plaque behind the Qing Temple's main door dimmed to the shadow's attack, and Fan Xian's floating body leaving the temple in a harmonious manner, only a blink of an eye had passed. The shadow's ruthless attack had not stopped, but Fan Xian did not allow his sword to enter a harmonious state again. Forcefully going against the flow, he left hand in hand with him. It was only at this moment that the ascetic monks, sitting cross-legged in the rain, realized that something had changed. The ascetic monk in the center of the harmonious situation had already lowered his hand. He could no longer speak, but he continued to passively accept the infusion of power from his fellow disciples. His body abruptly trembled a few times in the rain and then fell down without a sound. The shadow had pierced through his neck, and Fan Xian's crossbow had pierced his brain. The poison had already entered his heart. In the end, he had suffered a backlash from the harmonious situation. Without question, this ascetic monk was dead. He could not be more dead. The rain was already heavy and chaotic, randomly hitting the bodies of the ascetic monks. They silently looked at their comrade's body. A moment later, they bowed in silence and quickly jumped out of the Qing Temple, chasing after the two figures that were about to disappear into the distance in the streets. No one knew if they would reflect on this. If the temple's edict was truly the will of heaven, then why were they unable to kill Fan Xian after putting in so much effort and even being willing to sacrifice their lives for a righteous cause? In the heavy autumn rain, Fan Xian and the shadow were like two gray shadows moving swiftly through the rain, under the eaves, in the dim sky, and through the silent streets. Not long after leaving the Qing temple, Fan Xian sensed that the clearly discernible aura behind him had caught up. Jingdo's Qing temple was 3 li outside. Usually, it was a very quiet place. Very few people passed by, and there were no private residences around that could be used. Today was another heavy rain, so there were no pedestrians taking shelter from the rain on the streets. This brought great inconvenience to Fan Xian and the Shadow's escape. Fan Xian's pale face was covered in rainwater. He turned his head to glance at the middle-aged man beside him, but did not see any expression on his face. Fan Xian knew that in the end, he had still underestimated those fanatical martyrs and the power of the divine path that had lasted for thousands of years on this land. In the past, perhaps it was because Master Ku He and Northern Shi's Tianyi Dao had stolen all the glory, or perhaps the ascetic monks of the Qing temple were not very eye-catching and only liked to preach in the most remote places, or perhaps the great and second priest of the Qing temple did not give people a sense of power. Fan Xian had never thought much of the Qing temple. However, today proved that this was a powerful enemy. Fan Xian even began to suspect that the knife formation the Tiger Guards used to defeat 9th-level aces was born from the miraculous combined attack of the Qing temple. Of course, if Fan Xian was still at his peak, he would not be in such a wretched state, particularly with his ability to escape so lightly. Born of the Overwatch Council, he, in the Shadow, the foremost assassin in the world, would not think much of the pursuing ascetic monks. Normally, he and the Shadow would hide their tracks and turn to carry out the most sinister and terrifying ambush against these stubborn ascetic monks. However, he could not do so today because of the 1,000 li of running, the grief in his heart, the exhaustion of the days of hardship, and the heavy injuries he received on the walls of Zhengyang Gate and on the execution field. Fan Xian's condition had already fallen to rock bottom. Particularly when he had fought head-on against a dozen ascetic monks earlier, he no longer had the strength to fight back. The expression of the Shadow beside him was cold and did not appear to be anything out of the ordinary. However, after many years of cooperation and closeness, Fan Xian could clearly see that the injuries on the Shadow's body were also very serious, perhaps even more serious than his own. Fan Xian knew why. The Shadow had only been injured once. That injury had been caused by Siga Jian. After learning of Chun Pingping's death, Fan Xian could clearly guess what kind of reaction the Shadow would have. He was clearly in Dongyi, but he had returned to Jingdo at almost the same time as Wang Qinian. The speed at which this foremost assassin returned was faster than Wang Qinian and possibly even faster than Fan Xian. With such a rush, the Shadow's injuries had presumably worsened. Fan Xian tilted his head and glanced at the Shadow, but didn't say anything. Split up in front, the Shadow spoke in a raspy voice. It carried a strange tone. It looked like this assassin also knew that their present situation could not be worse. They had to split up and divert the pursuing soldiers. Fan Xian nodded. He knew that if they split up now, the two of them would meet again soon. At the end of the street, the Shadow suddenly passed into a small alley. Perhaps in a moment, he would become a wretched merchant hiding from the rain under the eaves. However, before he left, he coldly said something that made Fan Xian's heart sink. His mouth began to taste bitter. When you're going to kill him, shout for me. Because of the impact these words had on his state of mind, Fan Xian ran a little further than he had planned. The ascetic monks behind him followed from a distance, but Fan Xian was not worried. He passed through a small alley and came to the intersection of Dongchuan Street. He entered the main hall of Damba Bookstore. When he came out through the back door, he had already become a scholar holding an umbrella. He came to the door of the Imperial College and saw hundreds of umbrellas, thousands of umbrellas, and the fresh-faced and sunny students under the umbrellas. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.